Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've gone back and forth for months about whether to share this. My buddy Trevor made me promise not to talk about it, but I can't keep it bottled up anymore. What happened to us last September in the North Cascades has completely changed me. I haven't been able to sleep properly since. Every time I close my eyes, I hear those sounds again. I need to tell someone who might understand. Trevor and I had been hiking buddies for years. We'd tackled most of the challenging trails throughout Washington and Oregon, priding ourselves on hitting spots most regular hikers wouldn't touch. We're both experienced. Proper gear, wilderness training, the works. We weren't some tourists with Nike sneakers and a bottle of Dasani. This trip was supposed to be our most ambitious yet. We'd planned to go deep into the North Cascades, way off the maintained trails. I'm talking about places where you need topographic maps and serious navigation skills. Trevor had found some forum posts about this pristine alpine basin surrounded by peaks that almost nobody visited. The satellite images looked incredible. A small lake at around 7,000 feet elevation, completely isolated, the kind of place where you could feel like the first human to ever set foot there. We started off from the trailhead on a Tuesday morning in early September 2017. The weather was perfect, clear skies, around 65 degrees. The first day was straightforward, following established Forest Service trails. We made good time and camped that night at a designated site. Day 2 is when we veered off the maintained path. The trail became more of a suggestion, overgrown with fallen trees and washouts. We had to rely on GPS coordinates and our maps. The switchbacks were brutal, climbing over 2,000 feet in just a few miles. We crossed several narrow ridges where one misstep would have sent us tumbling hundreds of feet down. But the views were worth it, valleys stretching out below us, completely untouched. We didn't see another human being all day. By the third day, my legs were burning from the climb, but adrenaline kept me going. Around mid-afternoon, we finally reached the basin we'd been aiming for. Man, I wish I could describe how beautiful it was without sounding like I'm exaggerating. The lake was this perfect, crystal-clear blue, surrounded by wildflowers even that late in the season. Rocky peaks formed a natural amphitheater around it. We were at least 15 miles from the nearest maintained trail, possibly more. We set up our tent about 50 feet from the lake's edge, on a flat patch of ground. There were a few stunted pine trees nearby and some larger boulders that blocked the wind. We cooked dinner as the sun started to dip, freeze-dried chili that tasted amazing after the day's hike. Trevor filtered some water from the lake while I got a small fire going in a ring someone had made years earlier. As darkness fell, we were sitting by the fire, sipping whiskey from our titanium cups and talking about routes for the next day. That's when I first noticed something was off. It took me a minute to identify what it was. Silence. Complete and total silence. If you've spent time in the wilderness, you know it's never actually quiet. There's always something. Frogs, crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals, the wind through the trees. But suddenly there was nothing. Even the constant mountain breeze had died. It was like someone had hit mute on the world. "You noticed that?" I asked Trevor. He nodded, looking around. "Yeah, weird." We sat there for maybe 5 more minutes, both feeling increasingly uneasy but not wanting to admit it. Then we heard it, a deliberate knocking sound. 3 distinct strikes, like someone hitting wood against wood. Knock, knock, knock. Then silence for about 30 seconds, then again, knock, knock, knock. "What the hell is that?" Trevor whispered. "Rangers?" I shook my head. "No way rangers are this far out." The knocking continued, coming from the forested slope to the east of us, maybe a quarter-mile away. Then, something responded from the opposite direction, from the western ridge. It wasn't more knocking. It was a sound I've struggled to describe ever since. The closest I can come is to call it a vocalization, deep, rolling and complex. It started low, then rose in pitch before dropping again, almost like speech, but definitely not human. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then silence. A few moments later, the original knocking responded, followed by another vocalization from yet a third direction. This one higher pitched but with the same speech-like quality. Trevor and I looked at each other, and I could see my own fear reflected in his eyes. "Bears don't make sounds like that," he said, his voice barely audible. "Nothing makes sounds like that," I replied. We instinctively moved closer to the fire, adding more wood to build it up. The vocalizations continued, now coming from at least 3 different directions around the basin. They were responding to each other. That much was clear. Whatever they were communicating, and we were sitting right in the middle of their conversation. I reached for my headlamp and switched it on, scanning the tree line about 200 yards away. That's when I saw them, eyes reflecting the light, yellowish green, blinking back at me. They were high off the ground, maybe 7 or 8 feet up. As I watched, transfixed, they disappeared, only to be replaced by another set of eyes a few yards away, then another and another. "Trevor," I said, my mouth completely dry. "We're surrounded." He had his headlamp on too, pointing in the opposite direction. "I see them over here too." We stood back to back, sweeping our lights across the perimeter of our camp. I counted at least 5 sets of eyes at varying heights, all watching us intently from just beyond where our light could reveal anything more than those reflective eyes. Then one of them moved forward, just enough to be partially illuminated by my headlamp. I'll never forget what I saw. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with incredibly broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. Its body was covered in dark hair or fur, except for parts of its face. The head was shaped oddly, conical, sitting directly on the shoulders with almost no visible neck. In the partial light, I could see its face had a pronounced brow ridge and a wide, flat nose. It made a sound, not the complex vocalization from before, but a short, gravelly bark. Then it deliberately kicked a rock toward us. The rock clattered to a stop about 10 feet from our fire. The message was clear. This wasn't a curious animal. This was aggression. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I slowly raised my hands, palms forward, in what I hoped was a universal sign of peace. The creature watched me, completely still, except for the rise and fall of its massive chest. For what felt like an eternity, we were locked in this standoff. Then everything went to hell at once. There was a crashing sound from behind our tent. Another one of them had burst through the underbrush on the far side of our camp. It didn't charge directly at us, but moved in a flanking pattern, circling to our right. Trevor yelled something I couldn't make out, and we both instinctively backed toward our tent. "We need to go," Trevor hissed. "Now!" We grabbed only what we absolutely needed: headlamps, water, jackets, and our small backpacks with energy bars and first aid supplies. We left the tent, most of our gear, everything else. The fire was still burning as we began backing away, keeping our lights trained on the creatures that were now moving more openly around the perimeter of our camp. As soon as we reached the trail we'd come up on, we turned and ran. I've never moved so fast down a mountain trail in my life, especially in the dark. Our headlamps bounced wildly, showing just enough of the path to keep us from tumbling off the edge. We didn't speak, just focused on putting as much distance between us and those things as possible. But they followed us. For miles, they shadowed us down the mountain. Sometimes they'd parallel our path through the trees. I could hear branches snapping and undergrowth being pushed aside. Sometimes they'd move ahead and across the trail. More than once, I caught glimpses of a massive shape crossing our path 50 or 60 yards ahead. Every few minutes, one of them would let out one of those high-pitched screams. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a cougar, not a bear, not an elk. It was like they were coordinating, keeping track of our position. About an hour into our descent, a large rock came tumbling down the slope to our right, bouncing across the trail just a few feet behind Trevor. If it had hit him, it would have seriously injured or killed him. There's no way that was natural. The angle was all wrong. They were trying to hurt us. We kept moving, fueled by pure adrenaline and fear. My lungs were burning, my legs shaking, but stopping wasn't an option. The pursuit continued for hours. Even when we reached some of the wider, more established trails lower on the mountain, we could still hear them moving through the forest parallel to us, still communicating with those vocalizations. It wasn't until the sky began to lighten that the sounds finally faded away. By the time the sun rose, we had hiked nearly 12 miles downhill in the dark, stumbling and sliding much of the way. We reached our car around 7 in the morning, threw our remaining gear in the back and peeled out of that parking lot like the devil himself was chasing us. We barely spoke during the 3-hour drive home. What could we say? We both knew what we'd experienced wasn't normal wildlife behavior. Bears don't coordinate. Cougars don't communicate with complex vocalizations. Nothing known to science stands 8 feet tall with no neck and throws rocks at you. It was weeks before I could talk about it at all, and even then I was vague. I posted something online once, on a forum, but I held back most details. Trevor refused to discuss it entirely. He sold all his hiking gear the next month and moved to Chicago for a job opportunity that I think was just an excuse to get as far from the mountains as possible. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of territorial bear behavior we misinterpreted. Maybe the darkness and fear made us see things that weren't there, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Those weren't bears or any other known animal. They were something else. They were intelligent, they were communicating, and they wanted us gone from their territory. I've read about other encounters since then, strange experiences hikers have had in remote areas. The wood knocking, the rock throwing, the vocalizations. I'm not the only one who's experienced this. I haven't been back to the mountains since. I have all these perfectly good reasons I give people, too busy with work, bad knee acting up, getting more into cycling these days. But the truth is, I'm terrified. Every time I close my eyes and think about those woods, I see those reflective eyes staring back at me. I hear those sounds, those almost words, echoing across the basin. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear knocking, 3 distinct strikes. Knock, knock, knock. My girlfriend says I talk in my sleep now, making strange sounds she can't understand. I don't know what we encountered up there in the North Cascades. I don't know if they were trying to kill us or just scare us away. But I do know they exist, and they're intelligent, and they consider those remote mountains their territory. I've thought about reporting it to someone official, but what would I say? Who would believe me? So I'm telling you instead. If you're planning a trip into those really remote areas where humans rarely go, just know that you might not be as alone as you think. And if you hear knocking in the woods, 3 distinct strikes, my advice is to get out of there as fast as you can. Don't wait around to see what's making the sound. I've left out the exact location of our trip deliberately. I don't want anyone else stumbling into that basin and experiencing what we did. But I needed to tell someone. I needed to get this out, because the weight of carrying this, of knowing what's out there and not being able to talk about it, has been crushing me for months. Sometimes I wonder if they're watching me now, if they somehow know I've told their secret. I look out my window at night, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I still have the coordinates of that basin on my GPS. Part of me wants to delete them forever. Another part wonders if I should go back, this time prepared, this time with cameras and maybe other people. But then I remember the sound of that rock whizzing past Trevor's head, and I know I never will. Story 2. I've been hesitating to share this experience for years. What happened to my cousin Mark and me in January 2001 still haunts me. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just an animal or my mind playing tricks. But I know what we saw that day in the Snoqualmie Pass backcountry. I know what followed us. For context, I'm not some amateur who panics at every rustle in the woods. I've been snowmobiling since I was 16, and by the time this happened, I'd been riding the backcountry for over a decade. Mark and I both knew those mountains like the backs of our hands. We'd spent countless weekends exploring the network of old logging roads east of Snoqualmie Pass. Winter was our element. That weekend started like any other trip. We'd rented this small cabin about 20 minutes from the main trails. Friday night, we arrived after work, unloaded our gear, and spent the evening checking our sleds. Mine was a Polaris RMK 800, not the newest model, but powerful enough for the deep powder we were expecting. Mark had just upgraded to a Ski-Doo Summit that he wouldn't shut up about. We had all the usual emergency supplies, extra fuel, avalanche beacons, first aid kit, the works. Saturday morning greeted us with perfect conditions. About 8 inches of fresh powder had fallen overnight, and the sky was that crystal clear blue you only get in the mountains during winter. The temperature was maybe 15 degrees, cold enough to keep the snow perfect, but not so brutal that you couldn't enjoy being outdoors. We hit the main trails around 9 in the morning, but quickly branched off onto some unmaintained logging roads. That was always our thing, pushing further into the backcountry than most riders, finding untouched powder and challenging terrain. There's something about being the first to cut tracks through fresh snow that's almost addictive. By early afternoon, we'd made it about 20 miles east of the main pass area. The riding had been incredible. Steep climbs up wooded hillsides, wide open powder fields, and technical sections through tight trees. We were both riding at the top of our game, and the adrenaline had us feeling invincible. Around 1 or 2 o'clock, we stopped at this ridge that overlooked a small frozen lake. I remember checking my watch and thinking we should start heading back within the hour if we wanted to get to the cabin before dark. The view from that ridge was spectacular. Nothing but wilderness stretching out toward the Alpine Lakes region. We killed the engines and stood there for a few minutes, just soaking it in. Mark wanted to scout around a bit, see if there was a trail down to the lake that might loop us back toward our starting point. While he was walking the edge of the ridge, I was taking some photos with this bulky digital camera I'd gotten for Christmas. Nothing special by today's standards, but back then, having a 3-megapixel camera felt pretty high-tech. That's when I noticed something odd on the lake below. From the ridge, I could see a perfectly straight line of tracks cutting across the ice. At first, I thought maybe another snowmobiler had crossed it, but something wasn't right about the pattern. They weren't sled tracks. They were footprints. Big ones. I called Mark over and we both stood there trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The tracks formed an unnaturally straight line, like whatever made them had a specific destination in mind and didn't hesitate for a second. We decided to head down to the lake for a closer look. The descent was steep, but manageable on our sleds. When we reached the lake's edge, we shut down the engines and walked out onto the ice. That's when we realized just how bizarre these tracks were. Each print was easily 20 inches long, maybe more, and they were spaced at least 2 feet apart, suggesting an incredible stride length. What really unsettled me was how deep they sank into the snow on the ice. Mark and I were both over 200 pounds in our gear, and our boots barely made an impression compared to these. The tracks were clearly foot-shaped with 5 distinct toes, and they were bare. No boot tread, no snowshoe pattern, just bare feet in 15-degree weather. I remember kneeling down and running my gloved hand along the edge of one print, feeling how the snow had compacted and slightly melted before refreezing around the edges. These weren't fresh, maybe a few hours old, but they weren't from days ago either. "What the hell makes tracks like these?" Mark asked, his voice quieter than usual. I had no answer. Nothing I knew of walked on two legs with bare feet this size in the dead of winter. We followed the tracks to where they exited the lake and disappeared into a dense stand of pines. Common sense told us to turn around, to head back to our sleds and continue our ride in another direction. But there's something about the unknown that pulls at you, especially when you're with someone else. Alone, I might have left. Together, our curiosity overwhelmed our caution. The forest beyond the lake was old growth, massive pines and firs creating a canopy that blocked much of the sunlight. The snow wasn't as deep here, maybe knee-high in drifts, but packed down to just above ankle level in most places. The tracks continued in that same purposeful straight line for about 50 yards, then suddenly veered right. What we found next still gives me chills. The tracks circled a massive pine tree twice, like whatever made them had stopped to examine something. The snow around the base of the tree was disturbed, with broken branches scattered about. One branch, easily 6 inches thick, had been snapped clean off about 8 feet up the trunk. A little further on, we came to a small ravine. The tracks went right up to the edge, where the snow was severely disturbed. It looked like something heavy had slid or jumped down, creating a small avalanche effect on the ravine wall. We carefully made our way down, finding more prints at the bottom, continuing through a particularly dense section of forest. That's when I first noticed the silence. If you've spent time in winter woods, you know they're never truly quiet. There's always something. Wind in the branches, distant birds, snow falling from limbs. But at that moment, everything went dead still. No birds, no wind, nothing but the sound of our breathing and the crunch of our boots in the snow. Mark grabbed my arm and nodded toward a patch of disturbed snow about 20 yards ahead. Something had been digging there, exposing the ground beneath. We approached cautiously and found what looked like claw marks in the frozen dirt. Not bear claws. These were too precise, almost like fingers had been deliberately digging for something. Then we heard it, a loud snap behind us that echoed through the silent forest. We both spun around, and I nearly lost my balance. About 30 yards back, partially concealed behind a curtain of pine branches, stood something that shouldn't exist. My first thought was bear, but that lasted only a split second. This thing was standing upright on 2 legs, and it was massive, at least 9 feet tall, with shoulders that must have been 4 feet wide. Its arms hung unnaturally long, the hands nearly reaching its knees. The entire body was covered in dark hair, not black exactly, but a deep brown that appeared almost black against the snow. I couldn't make out its face clearly through the branches, just the general shape of a large, somewhat pointed head. For maybe 5 seconds, we all just stood there, frozen in place. Then Mark whispered, "Brian, what the fuck is that?" His voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand him. Before I could respond, the creature took a deliberate step forward, moving one branch aside with its arm. That's when I got a better look at just how muscular it was. Its chest was barrel-like, tapering to a narrower waist, and it moved with purpose. Not the shambling gait of a bear on hind legs, but with the deliberate motion of something that naturally walks upright. It made this sound then. Not quite a growl, more like a deep grunt that I could almost feel in my chest. Mark stumbled backward in shock, falling into the snow. That sudden movement seemed to trigger something in the creature. It raised one powerful arm and slammed it against a nearby tree with such force that I heard the wood crack. The impact shook snow loose from branches 20 feet up. I rushed to Mark, grabbed his coat, and pulled him to his feet. "Run!" was all I managed to say. We turned and bolted through the snow, pushing through branches and stumbling over hidden obstacles. The forest floor was uneven, and the snow concealed dips and fallen logs that threatened to trip us with every step. Behind us, I could hear it following. Not running exactly, but covering ground with these powerful strides that somehow kept pace with our panicked sprinting. Each footfall made a distinct sound, a heavy thud, followed by the crunch of compacting snow. It was gaining on us. We burst out of the trees onto the frozen lake, running as fast as possible toward our snowmobiles on the far shore. That's when the projectiles started hitting around us. At first, I thought it was throwing rocks, but when one exploded near my feet, I realized they were tightly packed snowballs, each one the size of a basketball and hitting with enough force to crack the ice where they landed. One whizzed past my head and smashed into a tree at the lake's edge with enough force to send bark flying. This thing wasn't just trying to scare us away, it was trying to hit us. We reached our sleds gasping for breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my key into the ignition. Mark was already on his machine, frantically hitting the starter button. His engine roared to life just as mine caught. I risked one quick glance back as we pulled away. The creature had stopped at the forest's edge. It stood there perfectly still, just watching us. Even from 100 yards away, I could feel its eyes tracking our movement. It made no attempt to follow us onto the open ice. Instead, it raised one arm in what almost looked like a gesture of acknowledgement, then turned and disappeared back into the trees with surprising quickness for something so large. We didn't stop until we were back on the main trail, almost 10 miles from the lake. We pulled over at a small warming hut where a few other riders were taking a break. Neither of us said anything about what we'd seen. What could we say? That we'd been chased by a 9-foot-tall hairy monster. That we'd found impossibly large barefoot tracks in the middle of winter. We'd sound insane. Instead, we made up some excuse about getting turned around and losing track of time. We joined their conversation about trail conditions and the weather, trying to act normal while my heart was still racing so fast I could hear it in my ears. We got back to our cabin just as darkness was falling. Neither of us had much appetite, but we forced down some food and tried to process what we'd experienced. Mark kept insisting it had to be someone in a suit, playing a prank. I asked him what kind of person walks barefoot in 15-degree weather, throws snowballs that could concuss a person, and can snap thick branches with one hand. He had no answer for that. Around 10 that night, we decided to step outside for some air. The sky was clear, stars brilliantly visible above the trees surrounding our small cabin. We stood on the porch, breath fogging in the cold air, when Mark suddenly grabbed my shoulder and pointed toward the tree line about 50 yards from the cabin. There, clearly visible in the fresh snow, was a line of those same massive footprints. They led right up to the edge of the forest behind our cabin, stopped, and then disappeared back into the darkness between the trees. Whatever had followed us at the lake had tracked us all the way back to our cabin. It knew exactly where we were. We spent the night taking turns staying awake, jumping at every creak of the cabin and gust of wind. By morning, we'd convinced ourselves to leave immediately, cutting our weekend trip short. As we loaded our gear and sleds onto the trailer, I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that massive figure watching us. The forest remained still, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. We've never talked much about what happened that day. Mark eventually stopped snowmobiling altogether. I still ride, but never alone, and never in that part of the Snoqualmie backcountry. I've spent years researching what we might have encountered. The details match what people call Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but I never believed those stories before. Now I don't know what to believe. All I know is that something intelligent and powerful was out there in those woods. Something that could have easily caught us if it wanted to, but instead seemed more interested in warning us away from its territory. Sometimes when I'm riding and the forest goes quiet, I still get that sensation of being watched. And I wonder if it's out there following my tracks just as I once followed its. Story 3. I've been debating whether to post this for years. My friends and I made a pact not to talk about it, but honestly, I need to get this off my chest. It's been 24 years, and I still wake up some nights hearing those sounds. This happened in May of 1999. I was 32 then, an experienced hiker from Portland who'd tackled most of the major trails in the Pacific Northwest with my three closest friends, Mark, Chris, and Devin. We were always looking for more challenging hikes, places off the beaten path where we wouldn't run into other people. That spring, we decided to explore the western section of Gifford Pinchot National Forest. If you've never been, it's this massive wilderness area with old-growth forests and volcanic landscapes, beautiful but remote as hell. I remember reading through some obscure hiking forums where people mentioned unmarked trails along old creek beds that led to untouched areas. That's exactly what we wanted, somewhere truly wild. We packed enough supplies for 3 days, loaded up my Jeep Cherokee, and headed out early on a Friday morning. The drive took about 3 hours from Portland. We had to use these old Forest Service maps since the area we were targeting wasn't on any official hiking guides. After parking at this tiny, overgrown trailhead that barely qualified as a parking spot, we shouldered our packs and started following what was essentially a dried-up creek bed into the forest. The first day was grueling but amazing. We hiked about 8 miles through dense forest, climbing over fallen trees and pushing through undergrowth that clearly hadn't seen many human visitors. The isolation was exactly what we wanted. By late afternoon, we found this perfect spot near a shallow valley with steep cliffs on one side and thick forest on the other, a natural bowl that would protect us from wind and give us privacy. We set up our 2 tents. I shared with Mark while Chris and Devin took the other, and built a fire pit with stones from the creek bed. That first night was perfect. Clear skies, a million stars, no sounds except for the occasional owl and the crackling of our fire. We drank whiskey from our metal cups, told the same old stories we always shared, and felt completely disconnected from civilization. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. The second day, we explored the area around our camp, hiking up to the ridge above the valley and discovering this incredible viewpoint where you could see for miles across undisturbed forest. We found some strange things that day. A few oddly broken trees that didn't seem to have fallen naturally, and what looked like animal paths that were wider than deer trails but not matching any known game trail pattern I'd seen before. At the time, I didn't think much of it. We returned to camp as the sun was setting, made dinner on our portable stoves, and settled in for another night around the fire. That's when things started getting weird. Around 9 o'clock, I noticed Mark kept looking over his shoulder toward the tree line. When I asked what he was looking at, he just shrugged and said he thought he heard something moving. We all went quiet and listened. At first, there was nothing, but then I heard it too. A heavy shuffling sound, like something large moving slowly through the underbrush about 50 yards away. "Probably a deer," Chris said, but his voice had that forced, casual tone people use when they're trying to convince themselves of something. We tried to ignore it, but over the next hour, the sounds continued, moving in an arc around our camp, always keeping to the darkness beyond the firelight. Whatever it was seemed to be pacing around us, staying just out of sight. The movements were too deliberate for a deer or elk, which would typically move through an area rather than circling it. "I'm going to check it out," I finally said, grabbing my heavy Maglite flashlight. The others looked at me like I was crazy. "Don't go too far," Devin warned. "Seriously, Jason." I walked toward the edge of our campsite, sweeping the flashlight beam across the trees. The forest seemed to swallow the light after about 30 feet. I moved a little farther, heart pounding in my chest. Then I caught something. 2 reflective eyes low to the ground, maybe 20 yards away. They were close together and seemed small at first, like a raccoon or fox. But then something happened that I still can't explain rationally. Those eyes suddenly rose upward, climbing higher and higher until they were well above my height. Whatever I was looking at had stood up on 2 legs, and it was tall, unnaturally tall. The flashlight beam caught more details for just a split second. A broad face covered in thick dark hair, wide jaws, and those unblinking eyes reflecting my light. The face wasn't like any animal I recognized. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't human either. "Guys!" I called out, my voice cracking. "Get over here!" The moment I yelled, the figure moved with startling speed, disappearing into the darkness with a series of crashing sounds as branches broke under its weight. By the time my friends reached me, all that remained was the sound of retreating footsteps and this overpowering smell, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something musky and sour that burned my nostrils. "What the hell was that?" Mark asked, his flashlight beam darting nervously through the trees. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it was big, really big." We debated what it could have been. A bear standing on its hind legs was the most logical explanation, but none of us were convinced. The way it moved, the height of those eyes, the deliberate way it had been circling our camp, it felt wrong. We decided to build up the fire and take shifts, staying awake, just to be safe. Around midnight, with Mark and I on watch, while the others tried to sleep, the first rock hit our campsite. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a golf ball, but it came sailing out of the darkness and landed right in the middle of our camp. At first, we thought it might have been a pine cone falling from a tree, but then another one came from a completely different direction. "What the fuck?" Mark whispered. We woke Chris and Devin. Over the next 20 minutes, more rocks came flying into our camp from different directions, never large enough to cause serious injury, but definitely thrown with purpose. They weren't random, they were targeted. Some hit the sides of our tents, others landed near our feet, and one struck a tent pole with enough force to crack it clean in half. Between the rocks, we started hearing vocalizations from the forest, low, rumbling grunts that didn't sound like any animal native to the Pacific Northwest. These were interspersed with the sharp crack of breaking branches, as if something large was moving through the trees and deliberately snapping limbs. We abandoned our tents and huddled around the fire, building it up as large as we dared. None of us said the word that was on all our minds, but we were all thinking it. The rock throwing continued sporadically, always from different positions around our camp, suggesting that whatever was out there was mobile and coordinated. Around 2 in the morning, the rock stopped. The forest went completely silent, not even normal night sounds from insects or nocturnal animals. That silence was somehow more terrifying than the rocks had been. "Look," Devin whispered, pointing toward a gap in the trees about 40 yards from camp. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. A massive figure stood just beyond the reach of our firelight. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, with broad shoulders and a barrel chest. It was swaying slightly from side to side in an almost hypnotic motion. The fire reflected dully off its eyes, giving them an eerie amber glow. But it wasn't alone. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out a second figure, farther back and partially hidden among the trees. This one was moving, pacing back and forth between 2 large pines. When it passed through a gap in the forest, its silhouette was momentarily visible, just as large as the first, but moving with a different gait, almost restless compared to the stillness of the nearer creature. "Holy shit," Chris breathed. "There's 2 of them." None of us moved. We barely breathed. The creatures didn't approach any closer, but they didn't leave either. They maintained their positions, ensuring we knew they were there, watching us. I had the distinct impression they were guarding the forest line, keeping us contained within our campsite. Hours passed like this. We fed the fire with everything burnable we could find, even sacrificing parts of our gear when our firewood ran low. Nobody spoke above a whisper. The figures remained, sometimes changing positions, but always keeping us in sight. The closer one occasionally made deep, throaty sounds that seemed to be answered by its companion. When the sky finally began to lighten around 5 in the morning, the creatures melted away into the forest. We waited about 30 minutes after they disappeared, periodically scanning the tree line with our flashlights before making a decision. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice hoarse from the long night. "Now." Nobody argued. We grabbed only the essentials, water, some food, our car keys, and left everything else behind. Our tents, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, extra clothes, all abandoned as we quickly packed what we could carry in our day packs. The hike out was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every snapping twig made us jump. We moved as fast as we could through the rough terrain, constantly checking over our shoulders and scanning the forest around us. The feeling of being watched never left, even as we put miles between ourselves and our campsite. It took us about 6 hours to reach the trailhead where we'd parked. Only when we were inside my Jeep with the doors locked did we finally speak about what we'd seen. "Those weren't bears," Devin said flatly, saying what we'd all been thinking. "No," I agreed. "They weren't." "Bigfoot?" Chris asked, the word sounding strange and almost childish despite what we'd experienced. Nobody laughed, nobody scoffed. "I don't know what else they could have been," Mark said. "The height, the hair, the rock throwing, it matches all the stories." We drove back to Portland in near silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I dropped everyone off at their homes, promising to call the next day to figure out what to do about our abandoned equipment. That night, alone in my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about those creatures. I started researching Bigfoot encounters online and found hundreds of similar stories. The rock throwing, the intimidation tactics, the circling of camps. 2 days later, I worked up the courage to contact this local Bigfoot research organization. I felt ridiculous making the call, but the investigator who answered sounded completely unsurprised by my story. When I described how I felt the creatures wanted us to leave rather than attack us, he said something I'll never forget. "That means they let you leave." Those words sent a chill through me that I still feel today. They let us leave. As if we had only escaped because they allowed it. We never did go back for our equipment. We made a pact not to talk about that night, partly because we didn't want people thinking we were crazy, but mostly because none of us wanted to relive it. Over the years, we've drifted apart, not because of any falling out, but because every time we see each other, that night hangs between us like an unspoken question. I still hike occasionally, but never in remote areas, never overnight, and never in Gifford Pinchot. Sometimes when I'm in the woods, even on popular, well-traveled trails, I'll catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement that doesn't belong, listening for the snap of deliberately broken branches. I don't know what we encountered that night. I can't explain it scientifically or rationally. All I know is that whatever was watching us from the darkness wasn't something that should exist in our world. And yet it does, hidden in the remote corners of the wilderness where few people venture. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I'll wake up suddenly, certain I've heard rocks hitting the side of my house. Those are the nights I don't go back to sleep. Story 4. I've thought about sharing this for years, but finally decided to post it here. It happened back in July of 2007. My brother Alan and I had been planning a week-long hiking trip in Mount Rainier National Park for months. We're both experienced outdoorsmen, grew up hunting and fishing in the Pacific Northwest. But what happened on that trip? Well, I still can't explain it. We specifically chose a remote trail loop in the southwest corner of the park. We didn't want crowds or tourists, just wilderness, fishing and solitude. We'd done our research, had topographic maps, emergency supplies, and our rifles, which we were legally carrying. We've always been cautious when heading into remote areas. The first 3 days were exactly what we'd hoped for. Picture-perfect weather, successful fishing in ice-cold streams, and we even photographed some mountain goats on the rocky ledges above our second campsite. It was the kind of trip that reminds you why you love the outdoors. We'd hike 4 to 6 miles each day, set up camp near water, fish for dinner, and enjoy the complete silence that you can only find when you're miles from civilization. The fourth day is when everything changed. We'd hiked deeper into the park than most people venture, following a trail that had clearly seen little maintenance. In some spots, it had almost disappeared beneath ferns and underbrush. Around midday, we were working our way down into this beautiful ravine surrounded by massive old-growth cedars. The canopy was so thick that even though it was sunny, the forest floor was dim and cool. I was leading the way when I spotted something odd in a patch of soft earth where a small spring had created some mud. At first, I thought someone was playing a joke. There were these enormous footprints pressed deep into the mud. I'm not exaggerating when I say they were at least 18 inches long. They had 5 distinct toes and were wider across the front than any human foot. "Alan, check this out," I called back. "Someone's made some fake Bigfoot tracks." Alan caught up and squatted down to examine them. He's always been the more analytical one between us. He didn't say anything at first, just studied them, then followed the track line with his eyes into the brush. "Derek, I don't think these are fake," he finally said, his voice oddly quiet. "Look at the depth of the impression. Whatever made these was heavy, several 100 pounds at least, and look at how the mud is pushed up at the edges. That's consistent with actual weight distribution." I laughed it off. "Come on, man. Probably just some other hikers messing around." "With 18-inch feet?" Alan looked up at me. "And where are their boot prints leading to and from these fake tracks?" He had a point. There were no other human footprints anywhere nearby, just these massive barefoot impressions heading up into the denser forest. We took some photos and continued hiking, but the mood had shifted. We both kept scanning the tree line more than we had before. We hiked another 3 miles that day before finding a good campsite next to a creek around 5 in the evening. It was a beautiful spot. Clear water tumbling over rocks, a small clearing for our tents and good tree cover. We set up camp, fished for a while, caught some nice trout, and built a fire. After dinner, we secured our food in bear bags hung from a tall branch, cleaned up, and turned in around 10. The creek was maybe 20 feet from our tents, providing this perfect white noise that lulled me right to sleep. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up, but it was pitch black. What jolted me awake was a loud splash from the creek, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps moving through underbrush. My first thought was bear, so I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and called out to Alan in the next tent. "You hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah," came his response, and I could hear him loading his rifle too. We unzipped our tents at the same time and stepped out, flashlights scanning the area. The fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to see the outline of our campsite. That's when we both spotted it. Across the creek, maybe 40 feet away, was a massive figure crouching at the water's edge. Our flashlight beams caught it, and I swear my heart stopped. It was enormous, hunched over the creek, reaching into the water like it was scooping something out. At first I thought it was a bear fishing, but then it stood up. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over what I'd estimate as 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was covered in thick, matted black hair or fur. Its proportions were all wrong for a human. Impossibly broad shoulders, long arms that hung down past its knees, and a massive barrel chest. Its head looked almost dome-shaped with no visible neck, just this rounded mass that flowed directly into its shoulders. When it partially turned toward us, I saw its face in the flashlight beam. I've tried for years to find the words to describe it. The closest I can say is that it looked like a cross between a man and a gorilla. A pronounced brow ridge, deep-set eyes that reflected our flashlights with an amber glow, a wide jaw, and a flat, broad nose. Alan and I were frozen. We had our rifles, but neither of us even thought about raising them. It wasn't fear exactly, more like shock, like seeing something your brain can't process. The creature didn't run. That's what gets me to this day. It just stared at us for what felt like forever, but was probably 45 seconds to a minute. Then it made this low, rumbling grunt, not aggressive, almost like it was acknowledging our presence. Then it turned and walked into the forest, not rushing, not crashing through undergrowth in panic, just deliberately moving away. We could hear branches snapping as it disappeared into the trees. "What the fuck?" Alan finally whispered. "What the actual fuck was that?" We stayed up the rest of the night, feeding the fire until it was blazing, back to back with our rifles across our laps. We barely spoke. What was there to say? We'd both seen it. Neither of us were drinking or taking anything. It was real. When dawn finally broke, we should have packed up and hiked out. That would have been the smart move. But curiosity is a powerful thing. We wanted to know more about what we'd seen. After a quick breakfast, we crossed the creek to where the creature had been. The soft soil by the water's edge had clear impressions. The same massive footprints we'd seen the day before. We followed its path into the woods for about 50 yards and found more prints where the ground was soft. We also found something else, a partially eaten fish carcass. It wasn't torn apart like a bear would do. It looked like something had meticulously removed specific parts. We decided to continue our planned route, but agreed to be extra vigilant. Around midday, we hiked up to a ridge that gave us a view of the surrounding valley. We were taking a break, eating some trail mix and hydrating, when we heard it, a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It started as a deep, guttural howl that rose in pitch until it became a piercing shriek. The sound echoed throughout the canyon, bouncing off the mountains. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard, not a wolf, not a cougar, nothing I could identify. It felt primal and ancient and sent chills down my spine. Alan grabbed my arm and pointed across the valley. Just below the tree line on the opposite ridge, maybe a mile away, was a large, dark figure pacing back and forth. Even at that distance, we could tell it was big. We watched it through our binoculars for almost 10 minutes before it disappeared back into the forest. "We need to get out of here," Alan said. I nodded, but we both knew we couldn't make it back to our car before dark. We were at least 15 miles from the trailhead, and some of the terrain was too dangerous to navigate in low light. We had to spend one more night. We found a defensible campsite around 4 that afternoon, an area with a rock face at our backs and good visibility in front. We set up our tents, but the mood was tense. We kept looking over our shoulders, scanning the tree line. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night was the longest of my life. We built a big fire and sat with our backs to the rock wall. Around 11, we heard movement in the forest around us, branches breaking, underbrush rustling. Something was circling our camp just beyond the ring of firelight. Then our tents started to move. Something was pushing against the fabric, sniffing loudly. The sound moved from my tent to Alan's, then back again. We had our rifles pointed toward the noise, but whatever it was stayed just out of sight. After a few minutes, the sounds retreated. We thought maybe it was over, until rocks started landing near our fire pit. Not thrown hard, just tossed in a way that made it clear something wanted us to know it was there. This continued for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost worse than the rocks. We sat there, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing but the crackling of our fire and the distant hooting of an owl. Neither of us slept. As soon as first light broke, we packed up faster than we ever had before and started hiking. We didn't stop for breaks, didn't stop for food. We hiked 10 miles straight until we reached our car. When we got back to civilization, we debated whether to report what we'd seen. Eventually, I decided to mention it to a park ranger at the station near the entrance. I expected him to laugh or dismiss it, but his reaction surprised me. He didn't seem shocked at all. He took notes, asked specific questions about the location, the footprints, and the vocalizations we'd heard. He never once suggested we were mistaken or making it up. When I finished, he just nodded and said, "You're not the first to report something like this in that area. Thanks for letting us know." That was almost 16 years ago now. Alan and I have never gone back to that part of Mount Rainier. We still camp and hike, but always in more populated areas. We don't talk about it much, even with each other. What would be the point? We know what we saw, what we heard, what we experienced. I'm still not sure what to call it. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, something else entirely. I don't know. But it was real, it was intelligent, and it wanted us to know we were in its territory. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I still hear that scream echoing through the mountains, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching hikers from just beyond the tree line. Story 5. I've been debating whether to share this for weeks now. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it's eating me alive and I can't talk to anyone about it without them thinking I've lost my mind. This happened about 2 months ago in the Willamette National Forest near Springfield, Oregon. I'm 19, lived here my whole life, and have been camping, fishing, and hiking since I could walk. My dad had us out in the woods every weekend growing up, and I always felt completely at home there. That's what makes this so messed up. The one place I always felt safe is now the last place I want to be. It was a Wednesday in late July, scorching hot, probably 95 degrees. I didn't have work that day and couldn't stand being cooped up in my apartment with that crappy window AC unit barely functioning. I decided to drive out to Fall Creek, this spot about 40 minutes from town that not many people know about. It's this perfect little swimming hole with crystal clear water and these smooth rocks, perfect for jumping off. I'd been going there since I was 13. I packed light, just a towel, my phone, which had almost no reception out there, a sandwich and some water. I was wearing my swim trunks under my shorts, so I wouldn't have to change when I got there. The drive out was normal, windows down, radio blasting. I remember feeling so relaxed, thinking about how perfect the day was going to be. When I pulled into the small dirt clearing where people park, there were no other cars. Not surprising for a weekday. I grabbed my stuff, locked my truck, and hiked the quarter-mile down to the creek. Everything seemed totally normal. Birds singing, the sound of the water rushing over rocks. Just a perfect summer day in Oregon. The swimming hole is this wider section of the creek where the water slows down and gets deeper, maybe 10 or 12 feet at the center. It's surrounded by these massive Douglas firs and hemlocks. The sun was filtering through the trees, making these golden patches on the water. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have this whole place to myself. I set my stuff down on this flat rock about 10 feet from the water's edge, stripped off my t-shirt and shorts, and waded in. The water was freezing at first, like it always is, but after a minute, it felt amazing compared to the heat. I swam out to the middle where it's deepest and just floated on my back, staring up at the trees and the bits of blue sky between them. I must have been out there for maybe half an hour, just swimming around, diving down to touch the bottom, the usual stuff. That's when I noticed something moving on the opposite bank, maybe 70 yards away. At first I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a deer coming down to drink, but then I saw it was person-shaped. My first thought was, great, someone else found my spot. I figured it was probably some hippie hiker. We get a lot of those around here. From that distance, it looked like a woman with long, dark hair kind of hunched over. I didn't think much of it. People come to swim all the time, but then this person, or whatever it was, started wading into the water from the other side. Something about the way they moved immediately seemed off. They didn't splash or hesitate because of the cold, just this smooth, deliberate movement into the water. And they didn't stop at the shallows. They kept coming, moving deeper into the creek towards the middle, towards me. That's when I started getting this feeling in my gut. You know that instinct when something is just wrong? Like every cell in your body is screaming at you to get away? That hit me hard. But I told myself I was being stupid. It's just another person coming for a swim, right? As they got closer, maybe 30 yards away now, I could see they were swimming with this weird frog kick motion, not like any swimming stroke I'd ever seen. Their head was above water, but in this unnatural way, like they weren't having to work to keep it up. And that's when the smell hit me. I can't even describe it properly. It was like roadkill that had been baking in the sun for days, mixed with something musky and animal. So strong I could smell it over the water between us. My stomach instantly turned, and I almost threw up right there. At 20 yards away, I finally got a clear look, and I realized this was no hippie woman. This was no person at all. The face was... God, I still see it when I close my eyes. It was flat and wide, with a pronounced brow ridge. The skin was this dark, leathery color, covered in reddish-brown fur. Not like a beard, but actual fur growing all over the face. The nose was wide and flat, almost like a gorilla's. And the eyes. Those eyes were completely black, like a horse's eyes, but they were focused right on me, with this intelligence that made my blood turn to ice. I froze for maybe 2 seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. My brain kept trying to make it make sense. Was it someone in a costume? Was I hallucinating? But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist. I started swimming for shore as fast as I could. I'm not a bad swimmer. Did it competitively in high school, but panic makes you sloppy. I was thrashing more than swimming, looking back every few seconds to see this thing gaining on me. It moved through the water with this effortless power that no human could match. I was maybe 10 feet from the shore when I felt something brush against my calf underwater. It wasn't a grab, just this light touch, like it was testing or curious. But it was enough to send me into complete flight mode. I swear I've never moved so fast in my life. I lunged for the shore and practically launched myself out of the water. I don't even remember my feet touching the rocks at the edge. I didn't stop to grab my towel or clothes. I just ran, soaking wet in my swim trunks, up the trail toward my truck. I was gasping for breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I kept thinking it was right behind me, about to grab me at any second. The quarter-mile trail seemed to stretch on forever. When I finally reached my truck, I realized I'd left the keys in the pocket of my shorts back at the creek. For a second, I thought I was completely screwed. But then I remembered I always leave a spare key magnetic box under the front wheel well for emergencies. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key out, but I finally did. I scrambled into my truck, locked the doors, and sat there hyperventilating. I was dripping wet, covered in goosebumps, and shaking uncontrollably. I kept checking all the mirrors, expecting to see that thing emerge from the woods at any moment. After maybe 5 minutes of sitting there with the engine running and my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest, I realized I couldn't just leave all my stuff down there. My phone, wallet, and clothes were still on that rock by the water. The thought of going back made me want to throw up, but I couldn't just drive off without that stuff. So I sat there for almost an hour, watching the trail, trying to convince myself to go back. I kept the engine running the whole time, finger hovering over the lock button, ready to floor it if anything appeared. Finally, I gathered what little courage I had left and decided I'd drive down the rough access road that fishermen sometimes use. It would get me closer to the creek without having to hike through the woods again. I put the truck in gear and slowly crept down this overgrown dirt track, branches scraping both sides of my truck. I didn't care about the paint job at that point. When I got to where the track ends, I was still about 50 yards from where I'd left my stuff, but at least I could see the clearing and the edge of the creek from there. I sat in the truck for another 20 minutes, scanning the area, the engine still running. There was no sign of whatever that thing was. Eventually, I couldn't wait any longer. I left the truck running, door open for a quick escape, and sprinted to where I'd left my things. As I got closer to the water, that smell hit me again, that rotten, musky odor. I grabbed my clothes and stuff in one quick swoop without even looking toward the water, but as I turned to run back to my truck, something made me stop. It was like I could feel eyes on me. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I looked toward the creek. There it was, standing on the opposite bank, perfectly still. In broad daylight, I could see it clearly now. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with this hunched posture. The body was covered entirely in that same reddish-brown fur, matted in some places. It was clearly female. It had breasts that hung down, like I've seen in pictures of female orangutans at the zoo, but larger. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging almost to its knees. The hands had these long fingers with dirty, thick nails that looked more like claws. But it was the face I can't forget. That wide, flat face with those black eyes just studying me. Not with anger or aggression, but with this calculated intelligence that seemed to be assessing everything about me. It wasn't the mindless monster from movies. This thing was thinking, watching, deciding. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, without any warning or sound, it simply turned and... I don't even know how to describe it. It didn't run away exactly. It just seemed to melt back into the trees, moving with this fluid grace that something that size shouldn't have. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, without a single branch moving or twig snapping. I ran back to my truck, threw my stuff inside, and got the hell out of there, driving way too fast on those forest roads. I didn't slow down until I hit the highway. When I got home, I locked every door and window in my apartment. I sat in my shower for almost an hour, but I couldn't wash away the memory of those eyes or that smell. For days afterward, I kept expecting to hear something on the local news, but there was nothing. I thought about reporting it to someone, but who? The police would think I was crazy or on drugs. Park rangers, they'd probably laugh me out of their office. It's been 2 months, and I haven't told anyone until now. I haven't been back to Fall Creek or anywhere in those woods. My friends keep asking me to go camping or fishing, and I keep making excuses. They don't understand why I suddenly want nothing to do with the outdoors when it used to be my whole life. I don't sleep well anymore. I keep waking up thinking I smell that rotten, musky odor in my room. When I do sleep, I dream about those black eyes watching me, not threatening, just observing, like I was some curiosity it had discovered. The thing that keeps gnawing at me is that it could have caught me in the water if it wanted to. It was faster than me, stronger than me. That light touch on my calf underwater, it was right there. It could have grabbed me, pulled me under, but it didn't. I keep asking myself why. Was it just curious? Was it playing with me? Did it want me to see it? I don't have answers, and that's the worst part. I've spent my whole life in these woods, and I never knew something like that was out there watching. How many times had it or others like it been nearby when I was camping or hiking, and I never knew? I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it if someone told me this story, but I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I know I'm never going back into those woods again. Whatever this thing was, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it, it's real, and it's out there, watching. I used to think the forest was my second home. Now I can't even look at the tree line without wondering what's looking back. Story 6. I've never really shared this with anyone outside my immediate family. It's been 13 years, and I still don't know what to think about what happened that day. I was 15 at the time, living just outside Lake Point, Oregon. I'm not some attention seeker or someone who believes every conspiracy theory out there. I'm just a regular guy who saw something I can't explain. It was mid-August, probably around 4 in the afternoon. I remember because the sun was still high, but starting to make its way down. I had spent most of that Saturday fishing at Miller's Creek, about 3 miles from our house. My dad had been on my case about being more responsible with Rex, our 2-year-old Rottweiler, so I had taken him with me. Rex was massive for his age, about 90 pounds of pure muscle, and he had this deep bark that would scare the hell out of anyone who didn't know what a softie he actually was. The fishing had been decent. I'd caught a couple of small trout that I'd thrown back, but mostly I was just killing time on a summer day. Around 3:30, I packed up my gear and started the walk home. There was this dirt road that cut through a patchwork of dense woods and Christmas tree farms. The Christmas tree farms were these weird open spaces with perfectly spaced little trees in rows, like some alien landscape compared to the thick forest around them. The walk home was something I'd done 100 times. The dirt road was rarely used except by the occasional farmer or logger. It was completely normal, nothing special about that day, which is why what happened next was so bizarre. Rex and I had been walking for maybe 20 minutes. He was off leash but staying close, occasionally running ahead and then circling back. Normal dog stuff. We were coming up on this section where the road runs between two Christmas tree farms. Young trees, maybe 3 to 4 feet tall on either side in perfect rows. I was lost in my own thoughts, probably thinking about what video game I was going to play when I got home, or something equally unimportant. That's when Rex stopped dead in his tracks. His entire posture changed in an instant. His ears perked up, his hackles raised, and he made this sound I'd never heard before. Not quite a growl, more like a nervous whine. It was unsettling because Rex wasn't the type to get spooked. This was a dog who would chase bears out of our yard without hesitation. I immediately scanned the area, thinking it might be a coyote or maybe a cougar. That's when I spotted movement in the Christmas tree farm to my left, probably about 400 yards away. At first, I thought it was an elk. We get plenty of them around here, and from that distance, all I could make out was something large moving through the small trees. But there was something off about the movement. Elk move in a specific way. They're graceful, but there's a certain pattern to how they navigate. This was different. It was moving upright. I stopped walking, put my fishing gear down, and just watched. Rex moved closer to my side, pressing against my leg, which was completely out of character for him. He's always been the type to run towards potential threats, not retreat from them. As the figure moved closer, I started to realize it wasn't an elk. It wasn't even an animal I recognized. It was walking on 2 legs, moving quickly through the Christmas trees. It had this weird, fluid gait, covering ground much faster than a person would. I remember thinking it had to be someone walking through the farm, but the way it moved was just wrong. Then it cleared the tree line and stepped into a gap between 2 sections of the Christmas tree farm, and for about 5 seconds I had a clear view of it. It was about 6 feet tall, covered head to toe in this thick, grizzly brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like human hair, but all over its body. It was walking upright on 2 legs, but its arms were longer than they should be, swinging in a way that seemed both natural and completely alien at the same time. Its torso was massive, way broader than any person I've ever seen. I couldn't make out facial features clearly from that distance, but the head seemed to sit directly on the shoulders, with almost no neck visible. The thing crossed about 20 yards of open space in maybe 4 strides. That's what really got to me, the speed. It was moving so fast for something that big. And the weirdest part? It was completely silent. When deer or elk move through woods, you hear branches snapping, leaves rustling. This thing made absolutely no sound. It was like watching a movie with the volume turned off. It passed within about 20 feet of where Rex and I were standing, frozen on the road. I don't think it even noticed us. It just continued its purposeful stride across the open space and into the taller trees on the other side of the gap. And then it was gone. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than 5 seconds, but it felt like time had slowed down. Rex and I just stood there for what must have been a full minute, neither of us moving. Then Rex let out this deep bark, not his usual warning bark, but something anxious and confused. I grabbed his collar and we started walking again, much faster than before. I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see it following us, but there was nothing. When we got home, I was shaking. My mom noticed right away and asked what was wrong. I told her what I'd seen, and to her credit, she didn't dismiss it outright. My dad was more skeptical when he got home from work, suggesting it was probably just a bear walking funny or my imagination running wild. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, and it definitely wasn't human. The speed and the way it moved were just wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying those 5 seconds in my head, trying to convince myself it was something normal. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that what I'd seen was something else. The next day, I convinced my friend Tyler to come back to that spot with me. I didn't tell him exactly what I'd seen, just that I'd spotted something weird and wanted to check it out. We spent hours combing through that section of the Christmas tree farm and the woods beyond, looking for tracks or broken branches or any sign of the thing's passage. We found nothing definitive. There were some broken branches and what might have been large footprints, but it had rained lightly overnight and the ground was a mess of mud and pine needles. I became a bit obsessed after that. I started researching online, looking up wildlife native to Oregon, trying to find something that matched what I'd seen. Nothing did. Then I started looking into Bigfoot sightings, something I'd always considered to be complete BS before. But some of the descriptions matched what I'd seen. The height, the hair, the way it moved. The thing is, most Bigfoot reports describe creatures that are much taller, like 8 or 9 feet. What I saw was large, but not that large. Maybe 6 feet, 6.5 at most. I've wondered if what I saw was a juvenile, or maybe a female, or maybe it wasn't a Bigfoot at all, but something else entirely. I went back to that spot dozens of times over the next few years, but I never saw it again. About 5 years ago, they cleared most of those woods to build a new housing development. The Christmas tree farms are gone now too, replaced by cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns. Sometimes I drive through that neighborhood and try to visualize where exactly the encounter happened, but it's impossible now with all the changes. Rex passed away 2 years ago at the age of 13. He was a great dog right till the end, but he never forgot that day either. For years after, whenever we'd walk anywhere near those woods, he'd get tense and stay unusually close to my side. Dogs know things we don't, and whatever Rex sensed that day, it scared him. That's what convinces me more than anything that what I saw was real. I've told this story to a few close friends over the years, and most of them think I'm either making it up or that I saw a person in a costume. But why would someone be in a costume in the middle of nowhere? And how could they move that fast, that silently? One detail that's always stuck with me is how it moved. Humans don't move like that. We bounce a little when we walk or run. This thing glided almost, covering ground in these long, fluid strides that seemed both efficient and somehow wrong. Another thing, I never felt threatened. It never even looked in our direction. It was like we weren't even there, or we weren't important enough to acknowledge. It was just passing through, going somewhere with purpose. Sometimes I wonder if other people in the area have seen similar things. I've checked local newspapers from around that time, looking for reports of strange sightings, but never found anything. Maybe others have seen it too, but, like me, were reluctant to come forward for fear of ridicule. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was just a bear with mange. Maybe it was some kind of escaped exotic pet. Maybe the light was playing tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I know none of those explanations fit. I'm 28 now, with a degree in environmental science. I work for the State Park Service, and I spend a lot of time in the woods. I've seen every animal native to this region up close, in all sorts of lighting conditions and situations. Nothing comes close to what I saw that day. I didn't have a phone with a camera back then. This was before everyone had smartphones. Even if I had, it happened so fast, I doubt I would have gotten it out in time. And honestly, part of me is glad I don't have a blurry photo that people could pick apart and dismiss. The memory is clear enough in my mind. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know if it was what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch or something else entirely. All I know is that for 5 seconds, when I was 15 years old, I saw something that shouldn't exist according to everything I've been taught about the natural world. And that changed me. I don't talk about it much anymore. Most people wouldn't believe me anyway, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I'm doing trail maintenance deep in the backcountry, I catch myself scanning the tree line, wondering if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I do, just to confirm I'm not crazy. But another part of me hopes I never do, because some things, once seen, can never be unseen. That Christmas tree farm and those woods are gone now, replaced by suburban houses and paved streets. Sometimes I wonder if the thing I saw is still out there somewhere, pushed further into the shrinking wilderness, or if it's gone for good. Either way, for 5 seconds on an ordinary August day when I was 15, my understanding of the world was shattered, and all these years later, I still haven't been able to put it back together again. Story 7. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm a middle school science teacher in southern Illinois, and what happened last spring during a field trip to the Garden of the Gods in Shawnee National Forest has fundamentally changed how I view the natural world. I've always been the rational, science-minded type who needs evidence before believing in anything. Now I'm not so sure anymore. It was a Thursday in late April, about 7 months ago. The weather was perfect. Mid-60s, slight breeze, blue skies with just a few clouds. I'd organized this trip for my 6th grade class like I have for the past 8 years. We had 3 chaperones along with me to watch over 23 11-year-olds. Everything started out completely normal. We arrived at the Garden of the Gods around 9 in the morning. If you've never been there, it's this incredible area with these massive sandstone rock formations that are hundreds of millions of years old. The views are spectacular, and it's perfect for teaching kids about geology, plant identification, and local ecosystems. I had the kids split into 4 groups, each with a chaperone. My group had 6 students: Madison, Tyler, Ethan, Jaden, Sophia, and Kayla. We started on the observation trail, which is this 1/4-mile loop with interpretive signs. It's paved and relatively safe, though there are some steep drop-offs on the edges that always make me nervous with kids this age. Around 11, we were gathered in a small clearing near the trail where I was showing the kids how to identify poison ivy and poison oak. You know, leaves of 3, let them be. Basic outdoor safety stuff. I noticed that Ethan and Jaden had drifted away from our group and were standing near the edge of one of the bluffs, pointing at something down below. I immediately felt that surge of adrenaline that hits when you think one of your students might be in danger. "Guys, back away from the edge, please," I called out, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. They didn't even seem to hear me, which was unusual. Both boys were typically attentive students. I quickly told the chaperone to continue with the lesson while I checked on the boys. As I approached them, I could see they were completely transfixed by whatever they were looking at. Their mouths were hanging open, and they were barely even blinking. "Boys, you need to step back from the edge. It's not safe to stand so close," I said, putting my hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Mr. Roberts," Jaden whispered, still staring down. "What are those things down there? Are they bears?" When I looked where he was pointing, my heart nearly stopped. I'll never forget what I saw. About 200 feet below us was a small stream that feeds into the larger creek system. Standing in the shallow water were 3 creatures that resembled nothing I've ever seen before in these woods. They were bipedal, standing upright on 2 legs, and they were covered in fur. 2 of them were large, probably 7 feet tall at least, with cinnamon-colored fur, slightly darker than an orangutan's. The third one was smaller, maybe 5 feet tall, with darker brown hair covering its body. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, people in suits or something, but the way they moved was so fluid, so natural. They were using their hands to scoop up what looked like fish or maybe crayfish from the water. Their movements were deliberate, almost human-like, but different somehow. More efficient, more primal. By this time, Sophia and Kayla had noticed their classmates' excitement and joined us at the edge. I should have immediately moved all the kids away, but I was so shocked by what I was seeing that I just stood there watching. "Are they monkeys?" Sophia asked, her voice rising with excitement. "There aren't any monkeys in Illinois," I replied automatically, teacher mode kicking in despite my shock. I don't know what those are." The creatures hadn't noticed us yet. They continued their activities in the water, occasionally making low sounds to each other that carried up the bluff. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd heard before, almost like deep, rumbling speech, but definitely not human language. Madison and Tyler had joined us by now, followed by our chaperone, Mrs. Caldwell. The other groups must have heard the commotion because several more students and another chaperone came over as well. "Oh my God," Mrs. Caldwell whispered. "Are those Sasquatch?" The word hung in the air. Bigfoot. The legendary creature I'd always dismissed as folklore and misidentification. Yet there they were, 3 of them, right in front of us. The commotion from our growing group finally attracted their attention. The smallest creature was the first to notice us. It looked up, froze for a second, then immediately bolted from the water toward the tree line. Its movement was incredibly fast. Not like a human running, more like a blur of motion. This caused the 2 larger creatures to look up as well. I'll never forget the moment when the largest one's eyes met mine. There was intelligence there. Unmistakable, calculating intelligence. For a split second, I felt like I was looking at another person, not an animal. Then, its expression changed to what I can only describe as alarm. It began vocalizing loudly, a series of sounds that included clicking teeth, whistles and guttural noises that almost resembled language. It seemed to be directing these sounds at the second large creature, almost like it was scolding or giving instructions. The second creature immediately began backing away toward the forest edge, but the largest one remained, still vocalizing. It was clearly agitated, occasionally slapping the water with its massive hands. I noticed it had a sagittal crest, a ridge of bone running along the top of its skull, which was visible even through the fur. This detail has stuck with me because it's a feature found in great apes, but not humans. Several of the kids started screaming and pointing, which only seemed to agitate the creature more. It suddenly leapt from the water onto a large boulder, a jump of at least 10 feet that it made effortlessly. Then it let out this high-pitched scream that seemed to cut right through me, like a mixture of a woman's scream and a mountain lion's cry. It was so loud and unexpected that several children began crying. "Everyone back to the trail now," I shouted, finally snapping out of my stupor. "Mrs. Caldwell, Mrs. Peterson, get the kids moving back toward the parking lot." The chaperones began herding the children away from the edge, but many kept looking back, some in terror, others in fascination. I stayed at the back of the group, partly to make sure no one fell behind, and partly because I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene below. The largest creature was now standing fully upright on the boulder, its chest puffed out, still making those vocalizations. It stood there watching us retreat, almost like it was making sure we were leaving. The second large creature had disappeared into the tree line. As we hustled back along the trail, the kids were a mixture of terrified and exhilarated. Some were crying, others were talking excitedly about what they'd seen. A few were completely silent, processing what had just happened. "Mr. Roberts, was that really Bigfoot?" Tyler asked, his eyes wide. "I'm not sure what we saw," I answered honestly, "but we need to stay together and get back to the bus." By the time we reached the parking lot, I had managed to gather all 23 students and the 3 chaperones. Everyone was accounted for, thankfully. The bus wasn't scheduled to pick us up for another 2 hours, so I decided the best thing to do was report what we'd seen to the park ranger station. I left the kids with the chaperones at the picnic area and walked over to the small ranger station. The ranger on duty, an older man named Bill according to his name tag, looked up from his computer as I entered. "Can I help you?" he asked. I took a deep breath. This is going to sound crazy, but I'm here with a school group, and we just saw what appeared to be 3 Sasquatch-like creatures down in the creek area below the observation trail. I expected him to laugh or look at me like I was crazy. Instead, his expression became oddly blank, almost too composed. He closed whatever he was working on and leaned forward. "How many people saw these creatures?" he asked, his voice neutral. "About 15 students and all 4 adults in our group," I replied. "They were large, bipedal, covered in fur. 2 were cinnamon-colored, 1 was darker brown. They were collecting something from the water." The ranger nodded slowly, writing nothing down. "And how did these creatures behave when they noticed you?" I described their reactions in detail. The smallest one fleeing immediately, the largest one vocalizing and displaying what seemed like protective behavior. Throughout my account, the ranger's face remained impassive. When I finished, he simply said, "We get reports of unusual wildlife sightings from time to time. The shadows in that area can play tricks on the eyes, especially with the rock formations." "This wasn't shadows," I insisted. "The entire class saw them. They moved, they vocalized, they reacted to our presence." He smiled thinly. "I'll make a note of your report. Sometimes black bears stand on their hind legs, which can give the impression of a bipedal creature. Could have been bears." "They weren't bears," I said firmly. "I know what a bear looks like." The ranger closed his notebook without writing anything. "Well, I appreciate you reporting this. I'll pass it along to our wildlife management team." I left feeling frustrated and dismissed. It was clear he wasn't taking our sighting seriously, or worse, he was deliberately downplaying it. When I returned to the group, the kids were still buzzing about what they'd seen. I decided to call the bus company and see if we could get our pickup time moved up. Thankfully, they were able to send the bus early, and we were back at school by 2 in the afternoon. I asked the students not to talk about what we'd seen until I had a chance to speak with the principal. But of course, by the time the final bell rang, the story had spread throughout the entire school. The principal called me into her office before I left for the day. She looked concerned, but not angry. "Dan, I've been getting calls from parents about some kind of Bigfoot sighting on the field trip today," she said, her tone making it clear she was hoping I'd tell her it was all a misunderstanding. I explained what we'd seen as clinically and scientifically as possible, emphasizing that I wasn't claiming it was definitively Bigfoot, just that we'd observed unidentified bipedal primate-like creatures that weren't consistent with known wildlife in the area. She sighed deeply. "You know how this sounds, right?" "I do," I admitted. "But 27 people saw the same thing. The children's reactions were genuine. Whatever we saw, it wasn't bears, it wasn't shadows, and it wasn't our imagination." That evening, I received 8 calls from parents. Some were angry, accusing me of scaring their children with Bigfoot stories. Others were concerned that their kids were having trouble sleeping. A few were simply curious, wanting to know more details about what we'd seen. The worst call came from Jaden's father, who said his son was now afraid to go into their backyard because he thought a Bigfoot might be hiding in the trees. I felt terrible. These were 11-year-old kids, and I'd exposed them to something that frightened them. At the same time, I couldn't deny what we'd all witnessed. Over the weekend, I spent hours researching Sasquatch sightings in southern Illinois. It turns out the Shawnee National Forest has a long history of such reports dating back decades. Many descriptions matched exactly what we saw: the cinnamon-colored fur, the vocalizations, the remarkable speed and agility. By Monday morning, I'd received an email from the school superintendent requesting a meeting to discuss the field trip incident. I knew my career could potentially be on the line. Talking about Bigfoot sightings isn't exactly what the school board expects from their science faculty. During the meeting, I stuck to the facts. I described what we saw without speculation, emphasized that I didn't specifically tell the students we'd seen Bigfoot, and pointed out that encountering unknown wildlife was always a possibility on nature excursions. The superintendent seemed skeptical, but ultimately decided not to take any disciplinary action. She did, however, suggest that I manage the narrative by framing the experience as a lesson in critical thinking, how our eyes and minds can sometimes misinterpret what we see in nature. I nodded and agreed, but inside, I knew what we'd seen was real. 27 people don't simultaneously hallucinate the same detailed creatures, complete with specific behaviors and vocalizations. It's been 7 months now. The story has died down at school, though I occasionally overhear students talking about Mr. Roberts' Bigfoot field trip. I haven't been back to the Garden of the Gods since then. Something about the way that creature looked directly at me, the intelligence in its eyes, has made me reluctant to return. I still teach my students about the scientific method, about requiring evidence before drawing conclusions. But I've become more open-minded about what might exist in the world's remaining wild places. The Shawnee National Forest covers over 280,000 acres. That's a lot of space for something to remain hidden, especially something intelligent enough to avoid human contact. Sometimes I wonder if that ranger knew more than he let on. His lack of surprise, his practiced dismissal of our sighting. It felt rehearsed, like he'd had that conversation before. Are these creatures known to the authorities? Is there some kind of unofficial policy to dismiss sightings to prevent panic or overwhelming public interest in protected areas? I don't have those answers. All I know is what I saw with my own eyes that April day. 3 creatures that shouldn't exist, according to conventional zoology, yet were undeniably real. The largest one's eyes still haunt me. That moment of connection, of recognition between 2 intelligent species. It knew what we were. It understood the threat we potentially posed to its family unit, and it acted to protect them. Just as I acted to protect my students. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just sharing what happened. 26 other people saw the same thing I did. Whatever you want to call them. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, unknown primates. They're out there in the Shawnee National Forest, and now I can't look at those woods the same way again. Story 8. I've been putting this off for a while now, but I think I need to finally write down what happened that night near Snoqualmie Mountain. It's been eating at me for months, and maybe sharing it will help me process it. I've read so many accounts on here, but never thought I'd be posting my own. For background, I live on our small family cattle ranch between Graham and Jacksboro in north-central Texas. Most folks don't realize just how remote and wild parts of Texas can be. Out here, we're surrounded by hundreds of thousands of acres of uninhabited ranch land near Possum Kingdom Lake. It's beautiful country, but isolated. I moved back about 15 years ago to care for my mum as her health started failing. Before that, I worked as a park ranger for almost 2 decades, hiking through wilderness areas all across America. I thought I knew wilderness. I mean, I've tracked animals, led search parties through dense forest, and spent more nights under the stars than I can count. But there's something different about actually living out here, where you develop this intimate connection with the land. After a few years back home, I started noticing things. Small things at first. When you live somewhere long enough, you get to know the sounds, the way deer move through brush, the specific calls of local birds, the rhythm of frogs and insects at night, even the distinct howls of different coyote packs. You develop a 6th sense for what belongs and what doesn't. I never gave much thought to Sasquatch before. Honestly, I figured if they existed at all, they were up in the Pacific Northwest, not Texas. But over the years, I kept hearing stories from locals. usually after a few beers when people felt comfortable sharing the weird stuff they'd seen without being judged. I started researching, reading reports, even connecting with other researchers. 15 years of gathering information, but I'd never seen anything conclusive myself. That changed 3 months ago. It was a clear night in early October, cool but not cold. Perfect weather for what some of us call squatching. I'd convinced 2 buddies, Mike and Dave, to come out with me near Snoqualmie Mountain in Jack County. We'd heard reports of strange activity in that area, wood knocks, unusual tracks, even a couple claiming they'd had rocks thrown at their campsite. We arrived just before sunset and set up a small, unobtrusive camp about half a mile from the creek. Nothing fancy, just folding chairs, some recording equipment, thermal images, and night vision. I'd learned that the Hollywood version of stomping through the woods, yelling and banging sticks, usually accomplishes nothing except scaring away wildlife. Real research is about patience and observation. After dark, we split up but stayed in radio contact. Mike positioned himself near the ridge overlooking the valley. Dave stayed by our base camp, and I took my spot by the creek where several game trails converged. I had my Gen 3 night vision monocular, not cheap, but worth every penny when you're out in the pitch black. For about 3 hours, nothing unusual happened, just the normal sounds of the Texas night. Crickets, the occasional coyote, a barred owl that kept me company for a while. I'd almost decided to call it a night when I noticed something odd across the field beside the creek. Through the night vision, I spotted what I initially thought was a cow. We're cattle country after all, and it wouldn't be unusual to find one that had wandered off from a neighboring ranch. It was dark, bulky, and seemed to be on all fours about 200 yards away. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds, trying to make out details. Something felt off, though. The way it was moving didn't seem quite right for a cow. Too deliberate, too aware. I decided to get a better look and turned on the infrared illuminator on my device. That's when everything changed. When the infrared light hit it, the cow stood up. It just unfolded itself from the ground and kept unfolding. What I'd thought was a large animal on all fours was actually something crouching down. Standing, it was enormous, easily 7 to 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders that must have been 3 feet across. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I just kept staring through my night vision at this massive figure standing perfectly still, as if it was staring right back at me. For what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds, we just stayed like that. Me frozen in place, it standing motionless across the field. Then it moved. God, the way it moved. In all my years as a ranger, I've never seen anything, man or animal, move like that. It was fluid, powerful grace, no lumbering or awkward steps like you'd expect from something so large. It turned and crossed that field faster than any human could run, yet it didn't seem to be in a panic. 3, maybe 4 strides, and it reached the tree line about 50 yards away, then vanished into the darkness. I finally remembered my radio and called Mike and Dave, my voice shaking so bad they could barely understand me. They came running, but by then there was nothing to see. We searched the area where I'd spotted it, but the ground was too hard for tracks in most places. Near the creek, though, we found something that made my stomach drop. 3 distinct tracks pressed into the mud at the water's edge. They weren't animal prints. They were foot-shaped, human-like, but massive, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length between them was over 5 feet. No human makes tracks like that. We stayed out there until dawn, but whatever I'd seen didn't return. The drive home was quiet. We were all processing what had happened. Mike and Dave saw the tracks, but they hadn't seen the creature. I could tell they believed something had been there, but they hadn't experienced what I had. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that moment when it stood up over and over. The size, the fluid movement, the way it just disappeared into the trees. That's when I remembered something my neighbor Tom had told me years ago that I'd half dismissed at the time. Back in the 90s, he'd been raccoon hunting on my property and claimed he saw an 8-foot-tall, hairy creature watching him from the tree line. Said it was the reason he never hunted at night again. I'd chuckled and offered him another beer when he told me that story. I wasn't chuckling anymore. The next day, I started walking my property with new eyes. The back section borders dense woods that stretch for miles without roads or houses. I'd always loved that privacy, but now it felt different. I was looking for signs I'd previously ignored or rationalized away. It didn't take long to find them. Behind the old barn, about half a mile from my house, I found 3 distinct tracks, just like the ones by the creek. 16 inches long, 8 inches wide, pressed deep into a patch of soft earth. They led from the woods to my cattle trough and then back again. Something massive had come to drink in the night, probably many nights, while I slept unaware less than half a mile away. I called Tom that afternoon and asked him to tell me his story again, this time without my skepticism. He came over and we sat on my porch while he recounted his experience from the 90s. But he shared something else, something he'd never told me before. Tom had been running steel hog traps on his property for years. Heavy-duty, industrial-strength traps designed to catch wild boars that can weigh hundreds of pounds. 3 times in the past decade, he'd found the traps completely destroyed. Not just sprung or damaged, but literally ripped apart. The thick steel bars bent and twisted like they were made of wire. Game cameras he'd set up to catch the culprit were either smashed or, more unsettlingly, turned to face away just before the destruction occurred. But what really got to me was the cage story. 10 years ago, Tom was checking a large cage trap when something slammed the door shut behind him, trapping him inside. He said he heard heavy breathing. Then something large ran away through the brush, moving like a train. He was stuck in that cage for 6 hours until his wife came looking for him. I never saw what did it, he told me, his hands shaking as he sipped his coffee. But something smart enough to trap a human ain't no regular animal. After Tom left, I started reaching out to other neighbors, asking casual questions about strange experiences. The stories came pouring out once they realized I wasn't going to laugh them off. The Wilsons, 3 miles down the road, had been hearing wood knocks at night for years. Loud cracks that sounded like baseball bats hitting trees, always in patterns of 3 or 4, often with responses from different directions. Old man Jenkins, who owns the property adjoining the east side of my land, showed me strange structures he'd found in his woods. Teepee-like arrangements of branches, too high up to be made by kids, too deliberate to be random. Sarah, who runs the small organic farm by the lake, told me about camping in her back field and having rocks thrown into her campsite from the darkness, not rolled or kicked, but thrown with accuracy from the tree line, landing right next to her tent. All these people, my neighbors for years, had been keeping these experiences to themselves, afraid of being called crazy or superstitious, just like I would have done before that night. I've spent the last 3 months in a strange state of hyper-awareness. I've installed game cameras all over my property, though part of me isn't sure I want to capture anything on them. I've started keeping a journal of unusual sounds at night. I've even left apples and meat scraps at the edge of the woods, only to find them gone in the morning without a trace. Last week, I was checking the cattle at dusk when I heard it. 3 distinct wood knocks from the dense thicket beyond my fence line. Without thinking, I grabbed a branch and knocked back 3 times. The silence that followed was the heaviest I've ever experienced. Every cricket, every bird, every natural sound just stopped. Then, from much closer than the original knocks had been, came a response. 3 more knocks, so powerful I could feel the vibration in my chest. Whatever made that sound had moved at least 100 yards closer to me in complete silence, through dense brush in less than a minute. I didn't stay to investigate. I got in my truck and drove straight back to the house, hands shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. I sat up all night with my shotgun across my lap, listening to every creak and groan of my old farmhouse. Nothing approached the house that night, but when I checked my most remote game camera the next morning, it had been turned around to face the tree. The memory card was still there, but the last image was of a large blur of dark movement just before the camera was repositioned. I don't know what to do with all this. I've been a rational person my whole life. I've worked in the wilderness, studied wildlife, trusted science. But I know what I saw that night near Snoqualmie Mountain, and I know the tracks behind my house are real. There's something out there in the woods of north-central Texas, something large and intelligent that moves like nothing I've ever seen in all my years outdoors. Something that's probably been there all along, watching from the shadows while we convince ourselves we're alone. I still work my ranch every day. I still check the cattle and mend fences and live my life. But I don't hike after dark anymore. I don't dismiss the strange sounds I hear at night. And I always have the feeling I'm being watched from just beyond the tree line. I don't know if I'll ever see it as clearly as I did that night. Part of me hopes I never do. But another part wonders if it's been watching me for years, learning my routines, assessing whether I'm a threat. And now that I've seen it, now that I know it's there, I can't help wondering if something has changed in our unspoken arrangement. All I know for certain is that I wasn't the only one watching through the darkness that night on Snoqualmie Mountain, and whatever watched back is still out there. Story 9. This happened back in March of 2011. I've never shared this online before, but after reading similar accounts here, I feel like maybe someone has experienced something similar or can help me make sense of it. I live in Kelowna, British Columbia. If you're not familiar with the area, it's a medium-sized city nestled in the Okanagan Valley. Most people know it for the wineries and the lake, but we're surrounded by mountains and forests too. I've always been an outdoorsy type and hike regularly with my Doberman Kira. She was 4 years old at the time, and the best hiking companion I could ask for, alert, athletic, and well-trained. That morning started like any other hiking day. It was early March, and we'd had some snow earlier in the week, but it was starting to melt. The temperature had been hovering around 45 degrees for a couple days, creating that slushy, melting snow condition. I decided to take Kira up Dilworth Mountain for our morning hike. For context, Dilworth isn't some remote wilderness. It's literally right on the edge of the city. There are housing developments all around the base of it now, but back in 2011, the upper portions still had some decent, relatively untouched forest areas. I'd hiked there dozens of times before and never experienced anything unusual. I parked at the small lot near the water tower, and we set off around 7:30 in the morning. The city was just waking up below us, and the mountain was quiet. The main trail was muddy from the melting snow, but still easily navigable. Kira was doing her usual thing, running ahead, sniffing around, and then circling back to check on me. Normal dog stuff. We'd been hiking for maybe 20 minutes when I decided to take one of the less used side trails that branches off to the east. It's a bit steeper, but offers better views of the valley. This trail had more snow remaining since it gets less direct sunlight. The snow was about 3 to 4 inches deep in some spots, but melting. It was in one of these snowy patches that I first noticed the footprints. I almost walked right past them, to be honest. My mind didn't register what I was seeing at first because it seemed so out of place. What caught my attention was Kira's behavior. She suddenly stopped, her body tensing up, and then she lowered her nose directly to the snow and began intensely sniffing a particular spot. This was her tracking posture. The same position she takes when she catches the scent of deer or other wildlife, never for humans. I walked over to see what had caught her attention, and that's when I saw them. Footprints in the snow, but not normal footprints. These were massive. My first thought was literally, some teenager must have made fake Bigfoot tracks. I actually laughed out loud. I figured some local kids had taken wooden cutouts and pressed them into the snow for a laugh. But as I looked closer, I realized these weren't made from flat cutouts. They showed contours, they had depth, they showed the actual shape of a foot, with 5 toes clearly defined and what looked like natural pressure points where weight had been distributed. You could see where the heel had pressed deeper than the arch. I wear a size 10 hiking boot, and when I placed my foot next to one of these prints, it was dwarfed. This print had to be at least 16 or 17 inches long and about 7 to 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The stride length between prints was huge too, much longer than my natural stride. What really got me though was realizing there were 2 sets of prints. One was the massive set I'd first noticed, but parallel to it, maybe about 10 feet to the side, was a smaller set. Still bigger than a human foot, but noticeably smaller than the first set, maybe 13 inches long. Like an adult and a juvenile walking together. I'm not some Bigfoot enthusiast. I've always been skeptical about cryptids and all that. But standing there, looking at those prints, I felt a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the March temperature. It was like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. I kept trying to come up with rational explanations. Maybe someone with really big feet wearing some kind of weird shoes, but 2 sets of weird shoes and the natural foot shape? What about Kira's reaction? Speaking of Kira, she was absolutely fixated on these tracks. She kept her nose to the prints and then started following them, moving deeper into the trees off-trail. This was behavior I'd seen countless times when we encountered deer trails, but never with human prints. Dogs typically don't track humans the way they track animals. They just don't have the same interest in our scent. But she was treating these prints exactly like she would treat a deer trail. I called her name, but she was in full tracking mode and ignored me. This was unusual for her. She's extremely well trained and responsive. I had to whistle sharply twice before she even acknowledged me, and even then, she seemed reluctant to break off from following the tracks. When she finally came back to me, her body language was strange. She wasn't scared exactly, but she was hyper-alert. Ears forward, muscles tense, eyes constantly scanning the forest around us. I've never seen her so intensely focused. I debated following the tracks myself. They led off the trail into a denser part of the forest that climbs higher up the mountain. Part of me was intensely curious, but another part felt, I don't know how to describe it exactly. Not quite fear, but a deep unease, like I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to see. The rational part of my brain kept insisting there must be a logical explanation, but I couldn't come up with one that satisfied all the details I was observing. And Kira's behavior was what really threw me. She knows the difference between human and animal scents. She's encountered hundreds of human footprints on our hikes and never shown the slightest interest in tracking them. I stood there for several minutes, just staring at the prints and trying to make sense of them. The forest felt different suddenly, quieter. I became hyper-aware of the silence. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush. Just stillness. I decided to take a closer look at the tracks where they entered the tree line. I followed them for about 20 yards into the forest, with Kira now sticking close to my side rather than leading the way. The tracks continued in a straight line through the trees, heading up toward the less developed part of the mountain. As I studied the prints more carefully, I noticed other details. The stride length was consistently long, around 5 to 5.5 feet between prints. The smaller set had a slightly shorter stride, as you'd expect. Both sets showed the same foot structure, 5 toes, a wide ball of the foot, and a narrower heel. The impression depth suggested something heavy, much heavier than a person. By this point, I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy. The silence in the forest felt oppressive. I had the distinct feeling of being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. Kira sensed it too. She kept looking up into the trees and back toward the deeper forest, her ears constantly moving, tracking sounds I couldn't hear. I decided this was enough exploring for one day. I took one last look at the prints, wishing I had my phone out to take photos. This was 2011, before I carried my phone everywhere while hiking, and then called Kira to head back to the trail. We hadn't gone more than 50 yards back toward the main path when we both heard it, a cracking sound like a large branch breaking from the direction the tracks headed. It wasn't close, maybe a couple hundred yards away, but in the unusual silence of the forest, it was startlingly loud. Kira froze, her attention locked in the direction of the sound. The fur on her back rose slightly, not a full hackle, but enough to tell me she was on high alert. I've seen her confront aggressive off-leash dogs without batting an eye, but something about this had her concerned. Then came another sound, a sort of deep, throaty exhale or grunt. It wasn't particularly loud, but it carried through the forest. It didn't sound like any wildlife I'm familiar with from the area. Not a bear, not a cougar, not an elk. It was almost like a human sound, but deeper, more resonant. That was enough for me. "Come on, Kira, let's go," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, even though my heart rate had doubled. We headed back to the main trail at a pace that wasn't quite running, but was definitely faster than my normal hike. Once we were back on the main trail, I felt slightly more at ease, but Kira remained unusually vigilant for the rest of the hike. She stayed closer to me than normal and kept looking back toward the area where we'd found the tracks. We made it back to the car without further incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I'm not someone who spooks easily in the outdoors. I've encountered bears and cougars while hiking and remained calm, but something about those tracks and that sound in the forest triggered a primal kind of anxiety that I hadn't experienced before. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. I did some research online about Sasquatch sightings in the Okanagan Valley and was surprised to find quite a few reports over the years, some from areas not far from Dilworth Mountain. The descriptions of the footprints matched what I'd seen: the 5 toes, the natural foot shape, the impressive size. The next morning, I decided to go back and take photos of the prints. It had rained overnight, and much of the remaining snow was melting rapidly. When I returned to the trail, I couldn't even find the exact spot where we'd veered off. The forest looks different when the snow is melting, and without Kira, I left her at home this time. I struggled to locate the same side trail. When I finally found what I thought was the right area, the prints were gone, either melted away or so degraded by the rain that they weren't recognizable anymore. Part of me was relieved, to be honest. Since then, I've continued hiking Dilworth and other areas around Kelowna without any similar experiences. Kira passed away 3 years ago at the age of 11, and I now hike with my new dog, a German Shepherd named Max. He's never shown any unusual behavior on our hikes. I still don't know what to make of what we found that day. The rational part of me wants to believe there's some logical explanation. Unusually large humans playing a prank, perhaps. But that doesn't account for Kira's reaction or the sounds we heard. What strikes me most, looking back, is how close this was to populated areas. Dilworth Mountain isn't some remote wilderness. It's literally surrounded by housing developments and only minutes from downtown Kelowna. The idea that something unknown could be living so close to a city of over 100,000 people seems far-fetched. And yet, those prints were real. Kira's reaction was real. I've never been able to fully explain what we tracked that day on Dilworth Mountain, and I still get an uneasy feeling when I hike that particular section of trail. Sometimes I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if whatever left those tracks is still up there, watching hikers pass by on the trails below. Story 10. I've debated for years whether to share this. Even typing this out now, my hands are getting clammy and my heart rate's picking up. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here can make sense of what I saw. This happened back in 1995 when I was 16. My family owned this 40-acre property in the Catskills, about 100 miles north of NYC. It wasn't anything fancy, just some land with woods, a small cabin my grandfather built in the 60s, and enough open space that my dad let me ride my dirt bike whenever we went up there. Dad and I spent practically every weekend that summer building this amateur motocross track. Nothing professional, just berms, a few jumps, and a trail that wound through part of the woods and back into the clearing. It became our thing, working on the track together on Saturdays, then riding it on Sundays. By fall, it was actually pretty decent. Dad had even built this wooden ramp in one section that went through the trees. Looking back, it probably wasn't the safest setup. But when you're 16 with a dirt bike, safety isn't exactly your first concern. Anyway, it was a Tuesday in late October. School had an unexpected closure due to a water main break, so my mom agreed to drive me up to the property for the day while she visited her sister, who lived about 20 minutes away. The plan was for her to pick me up around 5, giving me several hours to ride alone. The weather was perfect, crisp but not cold, with that smell of fallen leaves that reminds you winter is coming. I remember feeling so free that day, having the whole place to myself. No dad telling me to take it easy on the jumps, no weekend hikers to worry about. Just me and my Yamaha YZ125. I'd been riding for about 2 hours, really pushing myself on the track we built. The bike was running great that day. I had this rush of confidence and was hitting every jump harder than I normally would. Around 2 in the afternoon, I decided to take a break, drink some water, then go for one more good run before starting to cool down. That's when everything changed. I was on what I called the forest loop of the track, the part that wound through the trees for about a quarter mile before coming back out to the main clearing. There was this wooden ramp my dad had built that launched you between 2 big maple trees. It looked sketchy, but actually had a smooth landing if you hit it right. I'd done it dozens of times before. I remember revving the engine hard as I approached, feeling the front wheel lift as I hit the ramp. I was completely focused on the landing when I saw it. Mid-air, just as I was at the peak of the jump, I made direct eye contact with something. Something that was partially extended from the brush, about 15 yards from where I would land. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. I can still see its face with perfect clarity. It had what I can only describe as an evil-looking grin. Its mouth was open like it was snarling or growling at me, but it was the eyes that really got to me. They were deep set in these abnormally large sockets, and there was undeniable intelligence behind them. Not animal intelligence, something else. I had maybe 2 seconds to decide what to do as I came down from the jump. Running away wasn't really an option. The trail was narrow, and turning around would have been impossible without stopping completely. My instinct was to throttle toward it, not to confront it, but because going forward was the quickest way back to the clearing. As I gunned the engine and headed in its direction, I noticed the creature seemed irritated by the noise. Its face contorted, and its head actually withdrew into what looked like its shoulders, kind of like a turtle pulling back into its shell. But I never got the sense it was intimidated by me, more like it was annoyed. The whole thing happened so fast, but certain details are burned into my memory. The creature had charcoal-colored hair covering most of its body, but its hands, which were gripping a tree trunk, looked almost Caucasian, though much larger than human hands. Its face was wide and flat, mostly covered in hair, but with exposed skin around the eyes and mouth that was a deep grayish brown. As I got closer, I genuinely feared it was going to lunge out and knock me off the bike. I actually closed my eyes for a split second as I passed within just a few yards of it. I could feel the adrenaline pounding through my entire body as I twisted the throttle to its limit, praying the bike wouldn't stall or hit a root. When I opened my eyes, I was emerging onto the main track. I didn't look back, not even once. I rode straight to the cabin, practically fell off the bike, and locked myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even hold my water bottle properly. I just sat on the floor against the door, trying to process what I'd seen. For over an hour, I stayed in that cabin, jumping at every sound from outside. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, or possibly some hunter in a ghillie suit. But I knew better. This thing was at least 7 feet tall and way too bulky to be human. And that face, no mask could capture the expression I saw. When my mom came to pick me up, I tried to act normal. I didn't tell her what happened. Who would believe me? Even I was starting to doubt my own experience by then. But that night, I broke down and told my dad everything. To his credit, he didn't laugh or dismiss me. He listened carefully, asked questions about specific details, and then said something that still sticks with me. The woods hold secrets we're not meant to understand. The next weekend, Dad brought 4 trail cameras to the property. We mounted them strategically around the track, especially near where I had the encounter. Every weekend for over a year, we'd check those cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever I'd seen. We never did. I didn't ride the forest section of the track for months. When I finally got the courage to go back there, it was always in broad daylight and always with my dad nearby. We never found any physical evidence, no footprints, no hair, nothing damaged or out of place. It was like it never happened, except I knew it did. What bothers me most, even now, almost 30 years later, is the intelligence I saw in those eyes. This wasn't just an animal reacting on instinct. There was calculation there, recognition, maybe even malice. I've read about Sasquatch encounters over the years, looking for something similar to what I experienced. Some details match up, but others don't. Most people describe feeling afraid, but not threatened. I felt both. The evil grin I saw isn't commonly reported either. Most accounts describe a neutral expression or even curiosity. I still own that property now. My parents signed it over to me when they retired to Florida. I take my own kids up there sometimes, but I've never rebuilt the motocross track. I tell them it's because I want to preserve the natural beauty of the land, but the truth is, I don't want them anywhere near that section of woods. Sometimes when I'm there alone, usually around dusk, I get the distinct feeling of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stands up, and I get this primal urge to get inside and lock the doors. Maybe it's just my imagination, the trauma of that day playing tricks on me. Or maybe whatever I saw that day is still out there, watching and waiting. I've had people suggest that what I saw was just someone playing a prank, someone in a costume trying to scare the kid on the dirt bike. But that doesn't make any sense. We were on private property, miles from the nearest public trail. And the sheer size of this thing, it was massive, too wide, too bulky to have been a person in a suit. Last summer, my 16-year-old son asked if he could bring his dirt bike up to the property. I said yes, but I made him promise to stay in the clearing. When he asked why he couldn't explore the woods, I made up some excuse about erosion and protected plant species. The real reason is that I still can't shake the memory of those eyes, that grin, and the absolute certainty I felt in that moment that if I had stopped or crashed, I wouldn't have made it out of those woods. I don't know what I encountered that day in 1995. I don't know if it was a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or something else entirely. What I do know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and for whatever reason, it let me go. I still think about why sometimes. Was it just not hungry? Was it as surprised to see me as I was to see it? Or was it simply waiting for a better opportunity? I may never know the answers, but I do know this. I won't be building any more jumps in those woods. And every time I hear a twig snap or leaves rustle when I'm at the property, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting with that same evil grin. Story 11. I've never told this story publicly before. My friends think I'm making it up, and honestly, sometimes I wish I was. It's been 17 years. and I still can't explain what happened that afternoon in Boonboro. I've gone through every logical explanation, but nothing fits. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar and can help me make sense of it. Back in early fall of 2006, I had just moved to Boonboro, Maryland for work. I was 32, single, and starting fresh after a tough breakup in Baltimore. The town was smaller than I was used to, but I loved how it was nestled against the forests and mountains. The air felt cleaner, people were friendly, and I was slowly settling in. About 3 weeks after moving in, I met Brian and Natalie Henderson at a neighborhood barbecue. Brian was around my age, athletic, with this easygoing demeanor that made you feel like you'd known him for years. Natalie was warm and quick-witted. We hit it off immediately when we discovered we all shared a passion for tennis. "You should come by sometime," Brian had said. "We've got a court in the backyard, nothing fancy, but it gets the job done." I took him up on his offer the following weekend. Their house sat on about 2 acres at the edge of town, backing up directly to a dense forest that stretched for miles towards South Mountain. When I pulled into their driveway that Saturday morning around 10, I was genuinely impressed by their property. The house was a beautiful 2-story colonial with a well-maintained lawn that gradually gave way to a more natural landscape as it approached the tree line. Behind the house was exactly what Brian had described, a full-sized tennis court surrounded by a tall chain-link fence. The court itself was immaculate, but what really caught my eye was how seamlessly it integrated with the surrounding nature. Butterfly bushes and native plants bordered 3 sides, while the 4th side faced the forest directly with maybe 20 yards of clearing between the fence and where the trees began. "This is incredible," I said, as Brian led me through a side gate onto the court. "Thanks, man. Previous owners installed it. I'm just lucky enough to maintain it," Brian laughed, tossing me a fresh can of tennis balls. The weather was perfect that day. Not too hot, clear blue skies, with just the slightest breeze. We started rallying, and I quickly realized Brian was much better than he'd let on. We played competitively for about 30 minutes, talking between points about work, my move, and getting to know the area. It was during a water break that I first noticed something odd. I was leaning against the fence, chugging water, when I caught movement from the corner of my eye. Something dark shifting at the edge of the forest. I didn't think much of it initially. Deer were common in the area, and Brian had mentioned seeing foxes and the occasional black bear. We resumed playing, but I kept getting distracted by movement in the tree line. During a changeover, I finally got a clearer look. About 50 yards away, partially concealed by the underbrush, was what looked like a large black figure. At first, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, but the shape was wrong. Too slender, too tall. "Brian," I said, nodding toward the forest edge, "do you see that?" He squinted, following my gaze. "Huh, yeah, I do. That's weird." As we stood there watching, the figure moved slightly, and I realized there were actually 3 of them. 3 dark figures partially hidden by the vegetation. They were hunched over, moving with purpose, but not exactly like any animal I recognized. "Are those gorillas?" I asked, immediately feeling stupid. There obviously weren't wild gorillas in Maryland, but my brain was struggling to categorize what I was seeing. Brian didn't laugh at the question. He was focused intensely on the tree line. "No, definitely not gorillas, but I don't know what they are." The creatures moved closer to the edge of the forest, still maintaining their cover, but clearly watching us. That's when I got my first real look at one of their faces, and I felt my stomach drop. The face didn't have a protruding snout like a bear or any other woodland animal. It looked almost like a human baby's face inside a black hoodie. But that description doesn't quite capture it. The skin was entirely white, not like human skin, but porcelain white. Unnaturally so. The contrast against the black body was jarring. "Are you seeing this?" I whispered, not wanting to startle whatever they were. Yeah, Brian replied, his voice equally low. I've lived here 3 years and never seen anything like that. The creatures seemed more curious than threatening. The closest one had actually lowered itself to the ground, resting its chin on the forest floor, its large round eyes fixed on something near us. I followed its gaze and realized it was staring at a tennis ball that had rolled against the fence during our game. For several minutes, we just stood there in a strange standoff, watching them watch us. The creatures made no threatening moves. If anything, they appeared playful, shifting positions and occasionally making slight movements toward the fence before retreating back. I think they want the ball, Brian said suddenly, a note of wonder in his voice. He was right. The nearest creature's eyes hadn't left that tennis ball for a second. Its gaze was so intense, it was almost comical, like a dog fixated on a treat. Should we? I began, not sure what I was suggesting. Brian took a tentative step toward the fence where the ball rested. Hey there, he said softly, as if talking to a shy animal. You want this ball? The moment Brian moved toward the fence, the nearest creature quickly withdrew a few feet into the vegetation. It didn't run away completely, but definitely startled. Brian reached down slowly and picked up the tennis ball. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he tossed it gently over the fence. The ball bounced once and rolled toward the forest edge. What happened next still gives me chills. At least 2 of the creatures raced from their positions toward the ball with incredible speed. They moved on all 4s, but in a way that seemed both awkward and surprisingly efficient. One reached the ball first and touched it with what looked like a hand, not a paw, but a hand with long fingers. The creatures seemed to be playing with it, pushing it back and forth between them. Then, without warning, one of them exploded into motion. It sprinted directly toward the fence, not aggressively, but with the excitement of a dog chasing a toy. Before I could even process what was happening, it had leaped onto the chain-link fence and was climbing it with astonishing agility. Brian stumbled backward in shock, tripping over his own feet and falling hard onto the court surface. I rushed to help him up, my eyes never leaving the creature. It had paused halfway up the fence and was making a strange noise, a hissing sound followed by what I can only describe as a gurgling. Then it continued climbing until it reached the top of the 10-foot fence. There, it balanced perfectly, staring down at us with those innocent-looking eyes that nonetheless filled me with primal dread. Its body was covered in what looked like short black fur, but the face and hands appeared hairless with that unnatural white coloration. It wasn't massive, maybe 5 feet tall if it stood upright, but it had a compact, muscular build that suggested significant strength. "What the hell is that thing?" Brian whispered, now back on his feet, but keeping me between him and the fence. Before I could answer, the creature made its move. It hopped down from the top of the fence with remarkable athletic ability, landing on our side of the court. Despite what must have been a considerable weight, it made almost no sound when it landed, just a soft thud on the hard surface. For a single terrifying moment, it stayed in a crouched position, those round eyes fixed on us. I felt frozen in place, unable to move or even call out. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and bounded back to the fence, scaling it in seconds and disappearing over the top. By the time we rushed to the fence, all 3 creatures were retreating into the forest at incredible speed, moving through the underbrush with an efficiency that defied explanation. Within seconds, they had vanished completely, leaving no trace they'd ever been there except for the tennis ball, which was nowhere to be seen. Brian and I stood in stunned silence for what felt like minutes. "Did that really just happen?" I finally managed to ask. Brian looked pale. "Let's go inside." We abandoned our game and headed straight for the house. Brian's hands were shaking so badly he struggled with the door handle. Once inside, we found Natalie in the kitchen preparing lunch. "You guys are back early," she said, looking up from the counter. Her smile faded when she saw our faces. What's wrong? Brian, you look like you've seen a ghost. Not a ghost, Brian said, his voice unnaturally tight. Something in the woods. We saw... I struggled to find the right words. I don't know what we saw. They looked like monkeys or gorillas, but with these faces, like porcelain doll faces, Brian added. White, expressionless, but with these big eyes. Natalie stared at us for a moment before breaking into a laugh. Very funny, guys. What, did you hit the beer cooler already? Natalie, I'm serious, Brian insisted. There were 3 of them. One of them climbed over the fence and came onto the court. Her laughter faded as she realized we weren't joking. You're serious. Both of you saw this. We nodded. Did you get any pictures? Your phone was in your pocket, right? Brian's face fell. I didn't even think of it. Everything happened so fast. We spent the next hour describing what we'd seen in excruciating detail while Natalie listened, her expression shifting from skepticism to concern. She suggested calling the local ranger station, but Brian was hesitant. And tell them what? That we saw monkey things with human faces playing fetch? They'll think we're crazy or on drugs. He was right. Without evidence, our story sounded absolutely insane. We eventually agreed to keep an eye out and report it only if we saw them again. After lunch, despite our lingering unease, we went back out to retrieve our tennis equipment. I half expected to see the creatures waiting for us, but the forest edge remained still and ordinary. The only unusual thing was that we never found the tennis ball that had rolled away. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. I scoured the internet for any reports of unusual animal sightings in Maryland. I found plenty of Bigfoot stories, but none matched what we'd encountered. These weren't 8-foot hairy humanoids. They were smaller, more agile, with those distinctive white faces that still haunted my dreams. I became close friends with Brian and Natalie during my 3 years in Boonboro. We played tennis regularly, always with an eye on the forest edge, but we never again saw the strange creatures from that day. Sometimes, when the conversation lulled during our get-togethers, I'd catch Brian staring thoughtfully toward the woods, and I knew he was thinking about them too. I moved away in 2009 for a job opportunity in Colorado. Before I left, Brian confessed that he'd installed motion sensor cameras along the forest edge about a week after our encounter. He never captured anything unusual on them. 17 years later, I still don't have an explanation for what we saw that day. I've considered every possibility: escaped exotic pets, some undiscovered species, even the mundane explanation that it was just black bears with unusual coloration, and my mind filled in the rest. None of these explanations satisfy me. Sometimes I wonder if Brian and Natalie still live in that house, still play tennis on that court, still keep an eye on the forest edge. I wonder if they ever saw those creatures again, or if, like me, they've spent years trying to convince themselves it was something ordinary. What keeps me up at night isn't fear that these creatures were dangerous. They seemed more curious than threatening. What haunts me is the possibility that there are things in this world that defy categorization, things that slip between the cracks of our understanding, and that sometimes they peek out just long enough for us to question everything we think we know. Story 12. I still get the chills when I think about what happened to us at Milk Pond back in 2012. My husband Glenn and I love camping and fishing in the Yakima area. We've been doing it for over 20 years now. We know those woods like the back of our hands, or at least I thought we did until that weekend in early June. We'd been planning to head out earlier that Friday, but Glenn got held up at work, and we didn't hit the road until almost 4 in the afternoon. By the time we reached the turnoff for Milk Pond, the sun was already starting to sink behind the mountains. It's about 30 miles outside of Yakima, and the last 10 miles are all gravel Forest Service roads, slow going in our old Ford F-150 with the slide-in camper. Should we try somewhere else? I asked Glenn as we bounced along the washboard road. It'll be dark by the time we set up. Nah, we'll be fine. Besides, Milk Pond always has good fishing this time of year, he replied, both hands gripping the wheel as we navigated a particularly rutted section. It was nearly 8:30 when we finally pulled up to the small clearing by the pond. Twilight was fading fast, and the frogs were already in full chorus. It was peaceful, that familiar wall of sound that always makes me feel at home in the wilderness. The pond isn't large, maybe a quarter-mile across at its widest, surrounded by thick forest, mostly pine and fir with some undergrowth. Back then, before they clear-cut the area, it was really pristine. The kind of place where you could imagine no human had stepped foot for weeks. We were too tired to do much exploring, so Glenn just backed the truck up to a flat spot about 50 yards from the water's edge. We heated up some canned stew on our little propane stove, ate quickly, and crawled into the campers' sleeping area by 10 o'clock. The plan was to get up early and spend Saturday fishing at Milk Lake, which is about 5 miles further up the mountain. I remember falling asleep to the sound of those frogs. It was like white noise, constant rhythmic croaking that blended with the gentle lapping of the pond water against the shore. Glenn was snoring lightly beside me, and everything felt normal, safe, until it didn't. I woke up suddenly, completely alert, though I couldn't immediately tell why. Glenn was still asleep. The digital clock on our little battery-powered radio showed 2:17 a.m. Something felt wrong. Then it hit me. The frogs had stopped. All of them, simultaneously. The silence was jarring, almost painful to my ears after the constant background noise. I nudged Glenn. "Hey," I whispered. "Wake up." "Hmm?" he mumbled, rolling toward me. "Listen," I said. The frogs stopped. He was quiet for a moment, then came fully awake. "Huh, that's weird. Could be a predator," I suggested. "Coyote, maybe." Glenn sat up and reached for the flashlight we keep by the bed. "Maybe. But frogs usually just quiet down when something's moving near their part of the pond. They don't all stop at once, like..." That's when we heard it, a long, wavering whistle that seemed to come from the far side of the pond. It started low, then rose in pitch before trailing off. Nothing like any bird or animal I've ever heard in these woods. My skin instantly prickled with goosebumps. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, gripping Glenn's arm. Before he could answer, there was another sound, a series of sharp clicks, almost like someone clacking wooden sticks together, but with a rhythm that felt deliberate. The clicking paused, then the whistle came again, this time from a slightly different location, maybe 30 degrees to the left of the original sound. "Should we look outside?" I asked, though in truth I really didn't want to. Glenn shook his head. "Let's just listen for now." The clicking and whistling continued, sometimes from one spot, sometimes from another, like whatever was making the noise was moving around the far perimeter of the pond. After about 5 minutes of this, a second set of whistles started up, similar in tone, but clearly coming from a different location. It was like they were communicating. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The camper suddenly felt very small and very vulnerable. These weren't normal forest sounds. I've heard coyotes, owls, elk, even mountain lions. This was something else entirely. "Glenn," I whispered, "what is that?" He didn't answer right away. The whistling had changed to a lower, more guttural sound that almost resembled words, though not in any language I could recognize. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Could be a Bigfoot," Glenn finally said, his voice barely audible. I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. We'd heard stories, of course. Everyone who spends time in the Cascades has. Hunters and hikers talking about strange noises, unusually large footprints, feelings of being watched. But Glenn and I had always been skeptics. He's a former Forest Service guy, practical and knowledgeable about wildlife. He doesn't believe in things without evidence. Yet here he was, suggesting Bigfoot. And the terrifying thing was, I couldn't think of a better explanation. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes total. The whistling, the clicking, that strange, almost language. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence hung heavy for maybe 30 seconds, and then, just like someone had flipped a switch, the frogs started up again. All of them, all at once, as if nothing had happened. Jesus, Glenn breathed, finally lowering the flashlight he'd been clutching the whole time. That was, yeah, I agreed, not needing him to finish the thought. Neither of us slept much after that. We lay there listening to the frogs, jumping at every little sound that might not be a frog. When the first grey light of dawn began filtering through the camper windows, I felt a flood of relief. I'm going to look around, I told Glenn as I pulled on my boots and jacket. I'll come with you, he said, but I could tell he was exhausted. No, you rest. I'll just walk the perimeter of the pond, see if I can find anything. The morning was cool and misty, with that beautiful stillness you only get in the mountains at dawn. Birds were starting to wake up, and the frogs had finally quieted down. I grabbed our camera, an old digital one that wasn't great, but could still capture basic evidence if I found any, and set off around the edge of the pond. I was looking for footprints, broken branches, anything that might explain what we'd heard. The ground was mostly soft near the water, perfect for tracking, but I found nothing unusual. No large footprints, no disturbances in the vegetation that couldn't be explained by deer or raccoons. After an hour of careful searching, I had to admit defeat. When I got back to the camper, Glenn had coffee ready. "Find anything?" he asked, handing me a steaming mug. I shook my head. "Nothing obvious. You?" I walked up to the road and back, checking the clearing. Nothing there either. We sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping our coffee and watching the mist rise off the pond. "So what do you think it was?" I finally asked. Glenn shrugged. "Could have been people messing around, I suppose, though I didn't hear any vehicles. In the middle of the night, miles from nowhere, making those kinds of sounds." I wasn't convinced. "Well, the alternative is," he trailed off. "Bigfoot," I finished for him. The word hung between us, neither of us quite willing to fully embrace it, but unable to dismiss it either. After breakfast, we decided to stick to our original plan and head up to Milk Lake for some fishing. The lake is larger than the pond, higher up in elevation, and usually has good rainbow trout. Plus, I think we both wanted the normalcy of doing what we'd come to do, rather than dwelling on the strange events of the night. The drive up to the lake took about 20 minutes on an even rougher road. We parked in the small lot, empty as usual this early in the season, and hiked the quarter-mile trail to the lake with our fishing gear. The weather had turned beautiful, sunny with just a few clouds, and for a while, it was easy to push aside what had happened. We'd been fishing for maybe 2 hours, catching and releasing a few decent-sized trout when it happened. A sound like I've never heard before or since, a massive boom that echoed across the lake. It was like someone had picked up a 55-gallon metal drum and slammed it down onto solid rock, the impact reverberating through the entire valley. Glenn and I both jumped, our fishing rods forgotten as we spun toward the source of the noise, which seemed to come from a heavily wooded slope about half a mile away on the opposite shore. "What the hell?" Glenn muttered, shielding his eyes against the sun as he scanned the tree line. "That wasn't natural," I said, my voice shaking slightly. The peaceful feeling that had slowly returned during our fishing was gone in an instant. "Could be something fell. A dead tree, maybe," Glenn suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "Should we go look?" I asked, though part of me was already dreading what we might find. Glenn hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I think we should. Let's pack up our gear first, though." We quickly gathered our things and started making our way around the lake shore, toward where we thought the sound had originated. It wasn't easy going. There's no trail on that side, and the terrain is rough with fallen logs and thick underbrush. It took us nearly 45 minutes to reach the approximate area, and we found nothing. No fallen trees, no disturbed earth, no signs of anything that could have made that tremendous sound. We searched for almost an hour, working our way up the slope and then back down in a grid pattern. Nothing. But the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was like a physical sensation, a prickling between my shoulder blades that made me keep turning around, expecting to see someone or something standing there. Glenn felt it too. I could tell by the way he kept pausing to look over his shoulder, his hand instinctively tightening on the hunting knife he always carries. "You feel that?" I finally asked as we stopped to catch our breath near a small clearing. "Like we're being watched?" Glenn didn't need me to clarify. "Yeah, since we got here. It's the same feeling I had last night right before the frogs stopped," I admitted. Glenn's expression grew serious. "Linda, I think we should head back to the truck. Whatever this is, I don't think we're going to figure it out today." I nodded, relieved he'd suggested it first. As we made our way back to the lakeshore, I kept thinking about what had happened. The frogs stopping all at once, the whistling and clicking, this massive boom with no apparent cause, and now this persistent sensation of being observed by unseen eyes. "The frogs," I said suddenly as we walked. "That's what's really bugging me." "What do you mean?" Glenn asked. "When deer or elk come to the pond at night, the frogs get quieter if the animals are near them, but they don't all stop at once. Whatever was making those sounds last night, the frogs reacted to it differently than they would to normal wildlife." Glenn was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he finally said. "That is strange." We reached the truck without incident and drove back down to our campsite at Milk Pond. By unspoken agreement, we decided not to stay another night. We packed up our camp and were on the road by 3 in the afternoon. As we drove away, I kept looking back at the pond through the side mirror until it disappeared from view. It looked so ordinary, so peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. No one passing by would ever guess what we'd experienced there. It wasn't until we were almost home that I remembered something that still haunts me. "We had that old tape recorder with us," I said to Glenn as we turned onto our street. "We could have recorded those sounds." "Damn," Glenn muttered. "Didn't even think of it until now." That's the thing that really gets to me when I look back on it. We had the means to capture evidence of whatever it was we encountered. But in the moment, we were too shocked, too scared to think of it. By the time it occurred to us, the sounds had stopped. We've been back to that general area a few times since then, but never to Milk Pond itself. I heard they clear-cut a lot of that forest a couple years later. It's all different now. Sometimes I wonder if whatever made those sounds is still out there, or if it moved on when the habitat changed. I don't know what we heard that night. I can't say for certain it was Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it, but I know it wasn't anything normal. And I know that feeling of being watched, that primal sense of something intelligent and non-human observing us, was real. Glenn and I don't talk about it much anymore. What's the point? We have no proof, just our story, which sounds crazy even to my own ears sometimes. But on quiet nights, especially when we're camping, I find myself listening more carefully to the natural sounds around us and noticing when they suddenly stop. Story 13. I still think about that day from time to time. 3 years have passed, but I can recall every detail with crystal clarity. It was mid-October 2014. One of those perfect autumn afternoons in central Texas where the air finally cools down enough to enjoy being outside. The pecan trees in our front yard were dropping their bounty, and I figured it would be a good opportunity to collect some with my daughter Lily, who had just turned 4 that summer. Our property sits about a quarter mile from Lake Whitney, surrounded by dense woods on 2 sides. We've always loved the privacy and the connection to nature, even with the occasional coyote howls and other wildlife sounds. Derek, my husband, was inside watching football while Lily and I filled our buckets with pecans, making a game out of who could find the biggest ones. "Mommy, look at this one," Lily had squealed, holding up a particularly large pecan. I remember smiling at her, thinking how perfect everything felt in that moment. The sun filtering through the trees, my daughter's laughter, the simple joy of gathering food that grew on our own land. That's when I heard it, a high-pitched squealing coming from the pig pen about 50 yards from where we stood. Our neighbors, the Wilsons, kept a few pigs on their property adjacent to ours, and we'd grown used to their occasional noises. But this sound was different, distressed, panicked. At first, I thought maybe a coyote had gotten into the pen. We'd had problems with predators before. I straightened up, shading my eyes against the late afternoon sun to get a better look. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the woods, where our clearing meets the dense tree line, stood something I still struggle to describe in a way that does it justice. It was massive, taller than any man I'd ever seen, 8 feet at least, maybe even 10. The creature was covered in dark brown hair, matted in places like it had been walking through mud or burrs. But it wasn't the size that made my blood run cold. It was the face. The face was wrong. Not completely animal, not completely human. The features had a distinctly humanoid quality that made it all the more terrifying. Dark eyes set deep under a prominent brow ridge stared directly at me with an intelligence that no bear or other animal possesses. Its nose was broad and flat, and beneath it, a mouth that seemed capable of human expressions. In its massive arms that hung much longer proportionally than a human should, it cradled one of the Wilsons' piglets. The little thing was still squealing, its pink body squirming against the dark fur of whatever was holding it. For what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, we stared at each other. Me, frozen in place, and this creature regarding me with what I can only describe as curiosity mixed with wariness. It didn't seem aggressive, just aware. Aware of me as I was of it. Then reality came crashing back when I heard Lily humming to herself as she continued picking up pecans, completely oblivious to what was happening. My daughter was less than 10 feet away from me, her back turned to the woods, vulnerable and exposed. Pure maternal instinct took over. I dropped my bucket, pecans scattering across the grass, and lunged toward Lily. "Derek!" I screamed, my voice cracking with panic as I scooped her up. She started crying, confused by my sudden movement and the fear in my voice. "Derek, get the rifle!" I clutched Lily to my chest and ran for the house, not daring to look back. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I remember thinking irrationally that if I looked back, the creature would be right behind me, those long arms reaching out. Our front door was about 30 yards away, but it felt like miles. Lily was sobbing against my shoulder, asking what was wrong. Why was I running? Why was I scared? I couldn't answer her. All I could do was run and scream for Derek. The screen door slammed against the wall as I burst through it. Derek was already on his feet, alarmed by my screaming. "What's wrong? What happened?" he demanded. But I was gasping for breath, struggling to form words. "Outside, by the woods. It has a piglet," I stammered, setting Lily down and pushing her behind me, as if whatever I had seen might have somehow followed us inside. Derek grabbed his rifle from the cabinet where he keeps it locked. "Stay here," he ordered, and then he was gone, the door banging shut behind him. I sank to the floor, pulling Lily into my lap and trying to calm her down while my own heart still raced. Through the window, I could see Derek cautiously approaching the tree line, rifle raised and ready. He moved in a wide arc, scanning the wood's edge, then disappeared from view as he went to check the Wilsons' property. It was maybe 15 minutes before he came back inside, though it felt much longer. He set the rifle down carefully and sat across from me at the kitchen table. "There's nothing out there, Em," he said, his voice gentle but skeptical. No tracks, no sign of anything. The Wilsons' pigs are all accounted for. I stared at him in disbelief. All of them? Even the piglets? Derek nodded. Counted them myself. Martha Wilson came out when she heard me poking around, all accounted for. That's impossible, I insisted. I saw it, Derek. It was holding one of the piglets. Honey, he said in that tone that men use when they think you're being hysterical. It was probably just a bear. We've had them around here before. It wasn't a bear, I snapped, then lowered my voice when I saw Lily watching us with wide eyes from the living room. I know what a bear looks like. This was standing upright, completely vertical. It had a face, Derek, a face that looked almost human, and it was huge. Derek sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Maybe it was just the light playing tricks. The sun was starting to set. Shadows get weird. It wasn't shadows, I insisted. I know what I saw. But the more I tried to convince him, the more I could see him withdrawing, mentally filing this away as his wife overreacting. Eventually, I gave up. We went through the motions of dinner, bath time for Lily, and bedtime stories. But I kept glancing out the windows, expecting to see that face staring back at me from the darkness. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind through the trees outside had me sitting bolt upright, heart racing. I kept thinking about those eyes, the intelligence behind them, the way it had just watched me. The next morning, while Derek was getting ready for work, I slipped outside to look for myself. The ground was still soft from the rain we'd had earlier in the week, and I was certain I would find tracks, some evidence to prove to Derek that I hadn't imagined it all. Near the tree line, I found them. Footprints. Massive footprints that no human could have made, at least 16 inches long. They were partially obscured, as if whatever made them had been careful to stay where the ground was harder. But there was no mistaking what I was seeing. They weren't bear tracks. Bears don't walk exclusively on two legs, and these prints showed a creature that moved bipedally, with a stride length that was impossibly long. I took pictures with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I had to brace against a tree to steady myself. Then I followed the tracks as far as I could. They led deeper into the woods and then seemed to vanish where the ground became rockier and covered with pine needles. When I showed Derek the pictures, he squinted at them and said they just looked like depressions in the mud, maybe from deer or wild hogs rooting around. I could tell he was humoring me, and it made me furious. I knew what I'd seen. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with researching similar sightings in the area. It turns out Lake Whitney and the surrounding counties have quite a history of unexplained encounters. People reporting tall, hair-covered creatures in the woods. Strange howls in the night that don't match any known wildlife. Missing pets and livestock. I joined online forums where people shared their experiences, and the similarities to what I had seen were undeniable. Many described the same facial features, the same unsettling human-like quality to the eyes, the same matted brown hair. Derek worried about my fixation, as he called it. He suggested I talk to someone, meaning a therapist, as if I was the one with the problem. As if acknowledging that there are things in this world beyond our understanding was somehow a sign of mental instability. But I know what I saw that day, and worst of all, I know it saw me too. It saw Lily. We've since installed security cameras around our property. Derek thinks it's because I'm afraid of human intruders now, and I let him believe that. But really, I'm watching for something else entirely. 2 months after the incident, we found one of the Wilsons' pigs dead at the edge of our property. It hadn't been eaten, just killed and left there. Derek said it was probably coyotes, but the way it was placed, almost displayed, seemed deliberate in a way that animal predators don't behave. Sometimes at night, particularly when Derek is working late, I hear sounds from the woods. Not the normal hoots of owls or yips of coyotes, but deep, resonant vocalizations that make the hair on my arms stand up. Lily hears them too. She asks about the big monkey that lives in the trees. I've never told her what I saw that day. I've never explained why I suddenly snatched her up and ran for the house. But children have an intuition about these things. She refuses to play near the edge of the yard now, always staying close to the house. Last week I was hanging laundry on the line when I had that feeling, that prickling sensation of being watched. I turned toward the woods and for just a moment, I swear I saw movement. Something large shifting between the trees, just out of clear sight. I stood perfectly still, the damp shirt still clutched in my hands, waiting. Nothing emerged, but I know it was there. Derek wants us to have another child. I've been resistant, and he doesn't understand why. How can I explain that I'm terrified of bringing another vulnerable life into a world where I know there are things watching us from the shadows? Things that might decide one day that watching isn't enough. The worst part is the not knowing. Not knowing what it wanted that day, not knowing why it showed itself to me, not knowing if it's been watching us all along, or if that encounter was as random for it as it was for me. I've thought about moving, but something keeps me here. Maybe it's stubbornness. Maybe it's the need to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. Or maybe, deep down, there's a part of me that wants to see it again, to confirm beyond any doubt that what I experienced was real. We still gather pecans in the fall. Lily's older now, more aware of her surroundings. Sometimes she stops what she's doing and stares at the tree line, her small body going completely still. When I ask her what she's looking at, she just shrugs and says, "Nothing, Mummy." But I see the way her eyes linger, searching the shadows between the trees. I don't know if we'll ever have another encounter like the one that October day. Part of me hopes we don't, but another part of me knows that whatever it was, it's still out there, and for some reason it chose our property, our little corner of Texas, to reveal itself. So I watch the woods, and the woods watch back. And every time I hear an unusual sound in the night or catch a whiff of that strange musky odor that sometimes drifts across our yard, I remember those eyes, intelligent, curious, and somehow unmistakably aware of who and what we are. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Most days Derek still thinks I saw a bear and my imagination filled in the rest. But I know the difference between imagination and reality. I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere in the woods around Lake Whitney there's a creature that doesn't appear in any official wildlife guides. A creature that, for whatever reason, wanted me to know it exists. And that's the thought that keeps me awake at night, staring out at the darkness, wondering if somewhere out there it's staring back. Story 14. I still can't believe what happened to me last November. I don't talk about it much because people think you're crazy when you bring this stuff up, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe some of you have seen something similar. It was early November of 2022, around the first week. I remember because the elections were coming up and campaign signs were still everywhere. I live in Montana, just outside of Livingston. It's beautiful country out here, but remote. Lots of pine forests, mountains, wildlife. The works. I was driving home from work that day. I work as a veterinary assistant in Bozeman, and the commute is about 40 minutes each way. Usually, I enjoy the drive. It gives me time to decompress, listen to podcasts, that kind of thing. But as winter approaches, the days get shorter, and I was driving as the sun was setting. The sky was this deep orange-purple color, you know, the kind that makes everything look a bit eerie. I had my headlights on already, and I was on one of those winding back roads that cuts through the forest. Route 86, for those familiar with the area. There weren't any other cars around. There rarely are that time of day. I was coming around a bend, going maybe 45 miles per hour, when this deer just exploded out of the tree line. I'm not exaggerating when I say this animal was moving faster than I've ever seen a deer move. It was like something was chasing it. The deer was so panicked, it didn't even seem to register my car. It bolted across the road right in front of me, and I had to slam on my brakes to avoid hitting it. My heart was pounding, and I remember thinking, that was close. In Montana, hitting a deer isn't just dangerous for the animal. It can total your car and hurt you pretty badly too. So I was sitting there, hands gripping the wheel, trying to calm down. That's when I saw it. From the exact same spot where the deer had emerged, something else came out of the trees. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was massive, standing upright, bipedal, human-shaped, but not human, not even close. This thing was at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe taller. It was covered from head to toe in dark brown hair or fur. Not like a bear's fur, longer, more unkempt. I could see leaves and bits of forest debris tangled in the matted portions, especially around its lower back. The hair wasn't uniform. Some parts were thicker, some parts matted down, giving it this wild, natural look. My headlights were shining directly on it, so I could see it clearly. That's not something I'm grateful for, to be honest. Sometimes I wish it had been darker or foggy or something. But no, I saw everything. Its body proportions were all wrong for a human. The upper body was incredibly wide, shoulders like a linebacker but more massive, with thick, powerful arms hanging down. But its hips were narrower in comparison, which made the shoulder width even more pronounced. Its head was bulky and seemed to sit low between those shoulders, almost like it didn't have much of a neck. But the hands, God, the hands are what I remember most vividly. They were enormous, with thick fingers, and in one of those hands it was holding something, a large egg-shaped rock. I'm a fairly athletic woman, and I know I wouldn't have been able to hold that rock with one hand. It looked like it weighed as much as a bowling ball, but this thing was holding it effortlessly, like it was nothing. The creature stopped right at the edge of the road. It didn't run out like the deer had. It just stopped. And for a moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds that felt like an eternity, it just stood there. It didn't look directly at my car, but it clearly knew I was there. It's hard to explain, but there was an awareness to its movements that was undeniably intelligent. Then, as calmly as you please, it turned to its left, my right, and walked back into the forest. Not running, not hurrying, just walking with these strong, fluid strides. There was power in its movement, not the awkward lumbering you might expect from something so large. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. I sat in my car, completely frozen. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to floor it and get the hell out of there, but another part, the part that's been reading about cryptids and unexplained phenomena since I was a kid, needed to know more. So I did something really stupid. I drove forward slowly until I reached the spot where the creature had entered the woods again. I rolled down my window just a crack, and that's when the smell hit me. Holy shit, the smell. I've lived around farms. I've worked with animals that have been skunked. I've smelled some foul things in my life, but this was different. It was this powerful, musky odor that made my eyes water, like a skunk mixed with rotting earth and something else I can't even describe. It was primal and wrong and made every hair on my body stand up. My lizard brain was screaming at me to get away from whatever could produce a smell like that. But I didn't leave. Not yet. I peered into the forest, and about 50 feet in, I could still see it. The creature had stopped and turned back toward the road. Toward me. It was partially obscured by trees, but I could see its massive silhouette. And then I heard it. It started making these deep, raspy grunts. Even from inside my car, with the window barely cracked, I could hear them clearly. They weren't random animal noises. They had a pattern to them. 3 grunts, pause, 2 more grunts. Then it repeated the pattern. It was communicating something, maybe to me, maybe to others of its kind that I couldn't see. That's when fear finally won out over curiosity. I rolled up my window, made a 3-point turn as fast as I could, and drove away. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified that I'd see it following me out onto the road, but I never did. I didn't go straight home. I couldn't. I was too shaken up. I drove to a gas station about 20 minutes away, parked under the bright lights, and just sat there trying to process what I'd seen. I called my friend Mason, who's really into this kind of stuff. Works with a local research group that investigates cryptid sightings. I was talking so fast that he kept having to ask me to slow down. Mason drove out the next morning to check the site. He called me afterward and said he couldn't find any clear footprints. The ground was too hard and covered with pine needles, but he did find scuff marks in the dirt that suggested something had taken off at high speed. Probably the deer I saw. He also said he spent a couple of hours in the area and heard what he described as responsive whoops from different parts of the forest, like something was communicating over distances. A few days later, I got up the courage to drive that route again, this time in broad daylight. I know that sounds crazy, but I needed to convince myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I stopped at approximately the same spot, and while I didn't see anything, that same overwhelming odor was still there, though fainter. I know animals mark territory, and I couldn't help wondering if that smell was some kind of territorial marker. I've driven that road many times since then, always in daylight, always with my phone ready to take pictures. I haven't seen it again, but sometimes when I'm on that stretch of road, I get this feeling of being watched. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it, but it's like a pressure at the back of your neck. Your instincts telling you that something is there, just out of sight. I've spent countless hours researching Sasquatch sightings since this happened. The physical description of what I saw matches many other reports. The height, the proportions, the hair, even the rock it was carrying. Apparently there are quite a few reports of these creatures carrying rocks or sticks. The smell is also commonly reported. I don't know what to do with this experience. I've always considered myself a rational person. Before this, I was open to the possibility of undiscovered species, but never thought I'd encounter one myself. Now I don't know what to think. Was it a Sasquatch? Some undiscovered primate? A person in a very elaborate costume? Though I can't imagine why anyone would be out there alone in the woods dressed like that. What I do know is that I saw something that shouldn't exist, according to conventional science. Something that moved with intelligence and purpose. Something that was clearly adapted to life in those forests in ways humans aren't. The moments when it paused at the roadside, when our paths crossed for those few seconds, I can't shake the feeling that it was assessing me just as much as I was trying to comprehend it. There was a mutual curiosity there, beneath the fear. I still drive to work the same way. I still love Montana and its wild places. But I'm more cautious now. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't stay out as the sun sets. And whenever I pass that particular bend in the road, I can't help but scan the tree line, wondering if it's watching me from the shadows. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed longer that day, if I'd gotten out of my car, if I'd tried to communicate somehow. But mostly, I'm grateful that our encounter ended the way it did, with each of us returning to our respective worlds, changed by the knowledge of the other's existence, but otherwise unharmed. I don't have proof. No photos, no videos, no hair samples, just my experience and the lingering questions it left me with. I know how this sounds. I know many of you probably think I'm making this up or that I saw a bear standing on its hind legs or something. That's okay. I probably wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I know what I saw. And I know that deep in the forests of Montana, there's something extraordinary moving between the trees. Something that's managed to stay hidden for the most part, despite our roads and our towns and our endless development. Something ancient and powerful and, in its own way, magnificent. I've never been the same since that day. Not afraid, exactly. More aware. More awake to the possibilities of what might exist beyond the edges of what we think we know for certain. Sometimes I catch myself looking into the forests that surround my home, wondering if it's out there, wondering if it remembers our brief encounter as vividly as I do. Story 15. I've been a hunter for most of my life. Started going out with my dad when I was just a kid, and I've had my fair share of strange experiences in the woods. But nothing, absolutely nothing, comes close to what happened to me last November. I've spent months trying to process it, questioning what I saw, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw, and I can't explain it. It was mid-November of 2021. I'd been planning this hunting trip for months, a few days out near Lewiston, Idaho. The area is pretty remote with thick woods and steep slopes. Perfect deer country. I'd set up my ladder stand overlooking this natural draw on a wooded slope. It gave me a great vantage point. I could see movement in multiple directions, and the wind was in my favor. That morning started like any other hunting day. I woke up before dawn, had some coffee and a protein bar, and made my way to my stand in the dark. It was cold, that biting, damp kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I remember checking the time as I settled into position, around 5:30 a.m. The sky was just starting to lighten, that grey pre-dawn when shapes are just shadows. I'd been sitting there for maybe an hour and a half when I first heard something. It sounded like coyotes at first. You know, those typical yips and barks they make when they're communicating. Nothing unusual there. We've got plenty of coyotes in these parts, and I've heard them hundreds of times. I figured they were just hunting somewhere nearby. But then something changed. The sounds shifted. It's hard to describe, but they started transforming into something I've never heard before. These deep, resonant whoops, followed by what I can only call yell-like vocalizations. Not howls like a wolf or coyote, not like any animal I'd ever heard. They had this purposeful quality to them, almost like they were words but not human language. My skin immediately prickled, and I felt that instinctive alarm that hits when something isn't right. I sat completely still, barely breathing. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some weird echo, or maybe another hunter trying to spook game. But deep down, I knew better. Then I heard the footsteps, heavy, distinct footsteps, not like a deer picking its way through the underbrush, not like a bear's ambling gait. These were deliberate steps, bipedal steps, coming through the draw to my left. My heart was pounding so hard I swear I could hear it. My mouth went bone dry. Every instinct told me to get the hell out of there, but I was frozen in place, 20 feet up in my ladder stand. I slowly turned my head to look in the direction of the sounds. The steps were getting closer, crunching through the fallen leaves and snapping small branches. Whatever it was big, and it was moving with purpose. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape moving between the trees, about 70 yards away. But as it emerged into a slightly clearer area, I could make out its form more distinctly. It was walking on two legs, not hunched over like a bear might be if it stood up briefly. This thing was walking upright naturally, with a slight forward lean, moving with these powerful, deliberate strides. I remember thinking, that's not possible. That can't be a person. It was just too big, too powerful in its movements, and completely covered in dark hair, either black or a really deep brown. It was hard to tell in the early morning light. It walked at an angle away from me for a bit, then turned left to enter some particularly thick brush that led up the mountain slope. I had it in view for maybe 2 minutes total, long enough to know that what I was seeing wasn't normal. The proportions were all wrong for it to be human. Its shoulders were extraordinarily wide, and its upper body was solid with minimal tapering at the waist. Not like a person wearing bulky clothes. This was its actual build. And its arms. They hung much lower than a human's would, with minimal swing as it walked. I sat there completely still, barely breathing, watching this thing move through the woods with a kind of confident familiarity, like it knew exactly where it was going. After it disappeared into the thicker brush, I could still hear it moving up the slope. The sounds continued for a full minute after I lost sight of it. Branches breaking, Heavy footfalls, occasional rustling, then silence. I stayed in my stand for another hour, unable to move. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even hold my rifle properly. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Eventually, I climbed down and got the hell out of there. I didn't care about hunting anymore. I just wanted to get back to my truck. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I'd seen over and over in my mind. I've spent my whole life in the outdoors. I know what bears look like when they stand up. I know what other hunters look like from a distance. This wasn't either of those things. I called my dad the next morning. He could tell something was wrong from my voice. I tried to explain what I'd seen, half expecting him to laugh or tell me I was seeing things, but he didn't. He listened quietly, then asked if I wanted him to come out and take a look. We met up around 9 a.m. and headed back to the same spot. I was nervous as hell returning there, but somehow having my dad with me made it easier. He's been hunting these areas for 40 years, and if anyone would have a rational explanation, it would be him. We found the path where the creature had walked. The ground was soft enough that you could see depressions where heavy footsteps had been. My dad, who stands 6'4", walked the same path while I went back up in my stand to get the same perspective. What I saw chilled me to the bone. When my dad walked the exact same route, his head reached about 2 feet below where the creatures had been. 2 feet below. My dad is 6'4", so that would put this thing at around 8 feet tall. 8 fucking feet. See anything unusual? I called down, trying to keep my voice steady. There's some broken branches up high, he answered, pointing to places where limbs had been snapped about 7 to 8 feet off the ground. Would take something pretty tall to break these. We spent the rest of the morning looking for more evidence. We found a few more footprint impressions, but nothing clear enough to make a cast from. Just depressions in the damp earth that were much larger than either of our boots could make. What do you think it was? I finally asked him as we were heading back to our vehicles. He was quiet for a long time before answering. I don't know, Jackson, but I believe you saw something. Coming from my dad, that meant a lot. He's always been the skeptical type, the kind who needs hard evidence before believing anything out of the ordinary. It's been months now since that day, and I still can't make sense of what I saw. I've gone back and forth between rational explanations and the impossible. Could it have been another hunter in some kind of ghillie suit? No way. The height and proportions rule that out completely. A bear? Definitely not. This thing walked bipedally with purpose and confidence for a sustained period, not the awkward, brief standing that bears do. I've replayed that morning in my head hundreds of times. The sounds it made, those deep whoops and yell-like vocalizations, still echo in my mind. The way it moved, with such power and purpose through difficult terrain. The sheer size of it, making my 6'4" father look small by comparison. I've been hesitant to tell too many people about this. In my experience, there are two types of reactions. People either think you're crazy, or they get way too excited and start talking about Bigfoot expeditions and TV shows. Neither response helps when you're genuinely trying to understand something that shook your understanding of the world. But I know what I saw. Walking with purpose, 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, arms hanging lower than any human's. Moving through the brush like it belonged there, like it knew the terrain better than any of us ever could. I haven't been back to that specific hunting spot since. I'm not sure I ever will. Not because I'm afraid exactly, though there is that element to it. It's more that I feel like I witnessed something that wasn't meant to be seen. Something that's managed to stay hidden from most people for good reason. The strangest part. In all my years of hunting, I've never felt more like I was the one being observed. Like for those few minutes, the roles were reversed. I wasn't the hunter anymore. That feeling has stayed with me. The sensation that for a brief moment, I glimpsed something that exists in the shadows of our world. Something that watches us more than we watch it. Something intelligent enough to remain mostly unseen despite its massive size. I don't know what to call what I saw that day. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, an undiscovered primate. The label doesn't really matter. What matters is that it was real. It moved through those woods with the confidence of something that has done so for countless years, undetected and unbothered by human presence. Sometimes I wonder if it knew I was there in my stand, if those vocalizations were meant to communicate with others of its kind that a human was nearby. Or maybe it was completely unaware of me, just going about its daily routine in what it considers its territory. Either way, those 2 minutes changed everything I thought I knew about the world around us, about what exists in the remote corners of our wilderness, about how much we really know about the creatures we share this planet with. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods, but I'm more alert now, more aware. Every strange sound, every movement in my peripheral vision gets my full attention. Not out of fear, but out of a new awareness that there's more out there than I ever realized. I've told a few trusted friends about what happened, but most of them just give me that look. You know the one, where they're trying to decide if you're messing with them or if you genuinely believe what you're saying. So mostly, I've kept it to myself, until now. I'm not asking anyone to believe me, I'm just sharing what happened because I need to tell someone who might understand, who might have seen something similar, who might help me make sense of what I experienced on that cold November morning in the Idaho woods. All I know for certain is that I saw something that shouldn't exist according to conventional wisdom. Something powerful, intelligent, and wild. Something that has apparently managed to remain largely hidden despite its size. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I wonder if it's out there right now, moving silently through the darkness, living a life parallel to ours, but almost entirely separate. I don't have answers, just questions and the vivid memory of those 2 minutes that changed everything.